In this lesson, we will be learning about the EU OPS regulations concerning composition, qualifications, limitations and training for flight crew involved in commercial flying operations. The detailed information is contained in two major documents: the Aeroplane Flight Manual, AFM, and the Operations Manual. The minimum number of flight crew required for the aeroplane type used by an operator is specified in the AFM. If additional crew members are required, this will be specified in the Operations Manual. All flight crew members must hold an applicable and valid license acceptable to the authority, and be suitably qualified and competent to conduct the duties assigned to them. It is extremely important that an operator establishes procedures to ensure that inexperienced flight crew members are not crewed together for a flight. When suitably qualified, the holder of an airline transport pilot's license, A, or ATPL, may be appointed by the operator as commander of a multi-pilot crew. This post can also be known as Pilot in Command, or PIC. To either upgrade from co-pilot to commander, or for an existing commander joining an airline, a minimum level of experience is required, which is specified in the Operations Manual. For multi-pilot operations, the pilot must complete an appropriate command course approved by the authority, as defined in the Operations Manual. A command course must include training in a flight simulator or simulated training device, STD, and/or an aeroplane, an operator's proficiency check, commander's responsibilities, line training in command under supervision, a line check, and parts of crew resource management, CRM. These requirements will be explained in detail later. The holder of a commercial pilot's license, A or CPL, may be appointed commander of a single-pilot operation aeroplane to conduct passenger flights under Visual Flight Rules, VFR. This will allow the pilot to operate more than a 50 nautical miles radius from the aerodrome of departure. To do this, the pilot must have a minimum of 500 hours total flight time, or hold a valid instrument rating. The holder of a CPL may also be appointed commander of a single-pilot multi-engine aeroplane under Instrument Flight Rules, IFR. To do this, the pilot must have a minimum of 700 hours total flight time on aeroplanes, which includes 400 hours as pilot in command. The 400 hours must include 100 hours under IFR and 40 hours multi-engine operation. A concession allows 2 hours spent as a co-pilot in a multi-pilot crew to count as 1 hour pilot in command within the 400 hours total. A commander or a co-pilot can be relieved during a flight in order to prevent crew members suffering from fatigue. The rules governing relief are published in the Operations Manual, and we are required to have knowledge of them. The commander may delegate conduct of the flight to a suitably qualified commander or to a suitably qualified relief pilot or cruise relief pilot. If it is a relief pilot, he is only allowed to relieve the commander in operations above flight level 200 and must satisfy minimum requirements. For a relief pilot or a cruise relief pilot above flight level 200, the minimum requirements are to hold an airline transport pilot's license, A, ATPL, be converted and type-rated on type, recurrently trained and checked, and have route competence. The co-pilot may only be relieved by another suitably qualified co-pilot, or, when flying above flight level 200, a cruise relief pilot. In the case of the cruise relief pilot, he or she must hold a valid CPL with an instrument rating A. They must be converted and type-rated on type, be recurrently trained and checked, excluding the requirement for takeoff and landing. If a pilot changes to an aeroplane for which a new type or class rating is required, or moves to another operator, they must complete a conversion course. The course requirement is specified in the Operations Manual, which must include Crew Resource Management, CRM. The whole course must be carried out by suitably qualified personnel, and the amount of training required will be determined by the pilot's previous training, as recorded in their training records. The minimum standard required on the course is specified in the Operations Manual. If a pilot is required to operate a variant of a type of aeroplane, or another type of the same class, or when procedures or equipment is changed for types or variant, they will have to undergo differences and familiarization training. The course, which focuses on additional knowledge, can be carried out in a simulator or on the aeroplane. As an example, an operator may be operating 747 passenger aeroplanes and 747 cargo aeroplanes, or two types of Airbus, requiring differences and familiarization training. There may be occasions when a pilot is required to operate in either seat. This may be required when a training captain sits in the right-hand seat, when supervising a captain under training occupying the left-hand seat. The Operations Manual will specify the training required, which must include an engine failure after takeoff, a one-engine inoperative approach and missed approach, followed by a one-engine inoperative landing. The training can be carried out in a simulator or on the aeroplane, but if the aeroplane is used, the engine failure must be simulated. Once qualified, pilots will subsequently face a check of their abilities and further training on a regular basis. The operator will ensure that all pilots undergo what is known as recurrent training and checking, relevant to the type and variant of the aeroplane operated, as specified in the Operations Manual. On screen, the requirements are listed, each of which will be explained in detail. All qualified commercial pilots are required to undergo the operator proficiency check in accordance with ETOPS. The check will be carried out in a simulator conducted by qualified training pilots. The pilot under check will have to demonstrate competence and proficiency when carrying out normal, abnormal, and emergency procedures. The whole exercise will be flown under Instrument Flight Rules, IFR. The period of validity of the check is 6 calendar months, in addition to the remainder of the month of issue. All pilots will have to undergo a line check to demonstrate their competence in carrying out normal line operations, as described in the Operations Manual. This will entail a suitably qualified pilot sitting on the flight deck for the duration of a route and assessing the operation of the flight crew. The check pilot will submit a written report of the operational performance of the crew to the operator with appropriate recommendations. Once successfully completed, the line check will be valid for 12 months, dated from the last day of the month of issue. All pilots are to undergo annual training and checking on the location and use of all emergency and safety equipment carried on the aeroplane. The training and checking can be combined and can be carried out either on the aeroplane or a suitable training device. There is a standard list of items which must be covered each year, listed on screen. The validity is 12 months, dated from the last day of the month of issue. The operator is to ensure that elements of CRM are integrated into all appropriate phases of recurrent training, and that each pilot undergoes specific modular CRM training. All major CRM topics are to be covered over a period not exceeding 3 years, some of which are on screen. The operator is to ensure that all pilots undergo ground and refresher training at least every 12 months. The training normally takes the form of a questionnaire sent to pilots to complete and return for assessment. The topics covered must include aeroplane systems, operational procedures to include ground de-icing and anti-icing, pilot incapacitation, accident and incident occurrence review. The operator is to ensure that all pilots undergo aeroplane or simulated training device (STD) simulator training at least every 12 months. This is usually scheduled to be completed on the day prior to the proficiency check. All of the recurrent training and checking covered in this lesson, and irrespective of 6 or 12 months validity, will come under what is called the 3 months rule. To make this clear, let us consider the validity of a proficiency check, which, you will recall, is 6 calendar months, in addition to the remainder of the month of issue. If a subsequent check is carried out within the last 3 months of the current check, the date of expiry of the recent check will be 6 months from the expiry date of the previous check. An example with dates is on screen. In order to operate at the controls of an aeroplane in flight, a pilot must be in current flying practice. This means that the pilot must have flown the aeroplane or a flight simulator as a pilot flying (PF) or pilot not flying (PNF) and carried out 3 takeoffs and 3 landings in the last 90 days. The aeroplane or simulator must be the same type or class as the pilot's license. A pilot who does not hold a valid instrument rating is not to be assigned as the commander of an aeroplane at night, unless he has carried out at least 1 landing at night in the preceding 90 days. This applies to a pilot flying (PF) in an aeroplane or flight simulator of the same type or class. The 90-day period may be extended to 120 days under supervision of a type-rated instructor (TRI) or a type-rated examiner (TRE). For any periods beyond 120 days, the recency requirement is satisfied by a training flight or use of a simulator of the appropriate type. Before being allocated duty as a commander or pilot flying (PF), the operator is to ensure that the pilot has adequate knowledge of the route to be flown, procedures, facilities, and of all aerodromes to be used, including alternates. The period of validity of competence is 12 months, and the 3-month rule applies. The route competence knowledge required for a commander or PF is listed on screen. Operators are required to categorize all the aerodromes to be used, and pilots must be familiar with the classification system and requirements to operate in and out of the aerodromes. There are 3 categories of aerodrome: A, B, and C. A Category A aerodrome has to satisfy all of the requirements listed on screen. A Category B aerodrome requirement is listed on screen. A commander should be briefed or self-brief on this category of aerodrome and certify that he has done so. A Category C aerodrome requires additional considerations to a Category B aerodrome. A commander should be briefed on and visit the aerodrome as an observer and/or undertake instruction in a simulator. The operator is required to certify any instruction received by the commander. Pilots are only permitted to operate more than 1 type or variant if competent to do so. The operator makes the decision to use more than 1 type or different variant of a type, and must include the requirements in the operations manual. The considerations and inclusions for the operations manual are on screen. If a pilot operates both aeroplanes and helicopters, the operator is to ensure that the helicopters and aeroplanes are limited to one type of each. Appropriate procedures and operational restrictions must be approved by the authority and included in the operations manual. In this lesson, we have looked at the various composition of pilots, qualifications, regulations, restrictions and training according to ETOPS Subpart N. A knowledge of these requirements is essential for gaining a commercial pilot's license and for subsequent training and checking. A list of the topics is on screen. In this lesson, we will learn about the description, composition, and minimum requirements for the appointment and training of cabin crew, plus the operator's responsibilities for the storage of records and documents. ETOPS defines a cabin crew member as a crew member other than a flight crew member who performs, in the interests of safety of passengers, duties assigned by the operator or the commander of the aeroplane. In order that passengers can identify a cabin crew member, the crew member must wear the appropriate company uniform. Each cabin crew member must successfully complete an approved initial course of basic training. Following the initial course, or before converting from one aeroplane to another, a conversion course is to be successfully completed. The training must include Aeroplane Type Specific Crew Resource Management, CRM, as defined in ETOPS, and an Operator's CRM course. To be appointed as a cabin crew member, a person must be at least 18 years of age, medically fit, and physically capable of discharging the duties specified in the operations manual. There are some requirements in ETOPS regarding the number and composition for cabin crew on an aeroplane. They are: an aeroplane with a maximum approved seating of more than 19, with at least one passenger on board, must have one cabin crew, and for every 50, or fraction of 50, passenger seats on the same deck, one cabin crew member is required, or the number of cabin crew who actively participated in the aeroplane cabin during the relevant emergency evacuation demonstration, or who were assumed to have taken part in the relevant analysis, except that, if the maximum approved passenger seating configuration is less than the number evacuated during the demonstration by at least 50 seats, the number of cabin crew may be reduced by 1 for every whole multiple of 50 seats, by which the maximum approved passenger seating configuration falls below the certificated maximum capacity. To explain this, an example is on screen. In unforeseen circumstances, the number of cabin crew members may be reduced, provided that the corresponding number of passengers has been reduced, in accordance with procedures specified in the operations manual. In this case, the authority must be informed, and conversely, the authority can impose additional crew members. In aeroplanes where more than one cabin crew member is required, one member is to be appointed the Senior Cabin Crew Member, SCC. To be appointed as Senior Cabin Crew, the crew member must have not less than 1 year's experience, and must have successfully completed a training course, including appropriate crew resource management, CRM training. The Senior Cabin Crew Member, SCC, is to be responsible to the commander for the conduct and coordination of normal and emergency procedures as specified in the operations manual. If a period of air turbulence is experienced in flight with no instruction from the flight deck, the SCC is entitled to suspend non-safety related activities and illuminate the Fasten Seatbelt sign. Operators are to ensure that each cabin crew member undergoes recurrent training covering the normal and emergency procedures and drills relevant to the type and variant of aeroplanes flown. The training is to be in accordance with ETOPS and must be approved by the authority. The period of validity is 12 months, with the 3 months rule applying. If a cabin crew member has been absent from flying for more than 6 months and still remains within the current training validity period, he must complete refresher training before returning to flying duties. If the crew member has not been absent for a period of 6 months, but has not flown on the type or variant in that time, they must undergo a refresher course or operate 2 refamiliarization sectors. Cabin crew members are not normally permitted to operate on more than 3 aeroplane types, but exceptionally, the authority may approve operation on up to 4 types. The authority will impose conditions if approving 4 types, with the proviso that for at least 2 of the types, non-specific normal and emergency procedures are the same, and safety and type-specific normal and emergency procedures are similar. For this rule, the aeroplane variants considered to be different are listed on screen. Now that we have looked at the flight and cabin crew qualification and training, we will study the requirements for crew records and documentation storage periods. The operator is responsible for storing for specific periods all flight crew and cabin crew records in an acceptable form, accessible to the authority. In addition to keeping crew records, operators are also to ensure that all records and relevant operational technical information for each flight are stored in acceptable form, acceptable to the authority for set periods. ETOPS lay down minimum periods that operators must store all documents and records. Students are required to have knowledge of the storage period, and although the list is rather long, fortunately the majority of storage periods are for 3 months. The required periods of storage are shown on screen, starting with information used for the preparation and execution of flights, and continuing with reports, then flight crew records, and finally cabin crew records. During this lesson, we have studied the ETOPS requirements for the composition, conversion, training and checking of flight and cabin crew. In addition, we have studied the operator's responsibility for keeping and storing relevant records and documents for minimum periods. Long-range flights, by their very nature, engender numerous considerations and problems of flight management, such as operational and routing constraints, navigation and fuel planning, weather, crew rostering, crew fatigue and rest, passenger care, catering, emergency and survival considerations for remote areas, and so on. The vast majority of long-haul flights are likely to be established scheduled services on frequently used routes, and so would not require administrative tasks such as individual diplomatic clearances. But the planning and dispatch staff will need to roster flight and cabin crew who are within their rest times and will not exceed their crew duty limits in the course of the route, in accordance with the company limits. The operations staff will also need to book accommodation for the crew at their destination. The duty dispatch staff will organise the flight paperwork in time for the arrival of the flight and cabin crew. The flight crew will need the provisional load sheet, details of any special load, NOTAMs, notices to airmen, and aeronautical information service brief, weather reports and forecasts for the route, and the computer-generated flight plan, which they will load into the aircraft's flight management computer system once they are aboard. The cabin crew will be given the passenger manifest. If the aircraft has been operating on a previous flight As with any flight, it will need to be turned round. That is to say, it will need to be refueled and checked, the cabin cleaned and prepared, the baggage and catering loaded, and the appropriate paperwork completed before the passengers board the aircraft. After flight, if they have completed their duty time, the crew will commence their rest period, and the aircraft will be turned round for another sector or return flight with a different crew. Long-range flights across remote areas, and especially over oceans and polar regions, which are areas without airfields, radio stations, ground-based navigation aids or any other facilities, bring their own particular set of problems and considerations. This lesson will examine the equipment, techniques and procedures which have been developed over the years to make such navigation as safe and efficient as possible. Polar navigation routes take advantage of the shorter distances afforded by Great Circle tracks. Since the majority of the world's landmass is in the Northern Hemisphere, most of the commercial flights that use polar routes are over the Arctic. At the high latitudes involved, and polar navigation can be considered to be on north-south tracks north of 65 degrees north, and particularly over the northwest Atlantic and northeast Canada and Greenland, magnetic compasses become more difficult to use reliably because of the large and relatively rapid changes in magnetic variation in flight. The magnetic North Pole being located in northeast Canada to the west of Ellesmere Island. It is not in a fixed position, hence the ubiquitous constant small changes in variation, and in 2009 was moving northeastwards at about 60 kilometers per year, or about 6.8 meters per hour. It also has an elliptical diurnal oscillation up to 80 kilometers from its mean position. If an aircraft were to be positioned between the magnetic and geographic North Poles, the variation would be 180 degrees. That is to say, magnetic north would be true south. The potential for error if relying on magnetic compasses to navigate can be easily seen from the diagram. To avoid the problems of the magnetic compass, navigation is achieved using INS or GPS, or the technique of grid navigation, in which gyro compasses are run in gyro mode and aligned to grid north for the chart being used. Grid navigation and the use of polar stereographic charts are fully covered in the Navigation General Syllabus. True north can of course be used as a reference for navigation, and in the Canadian Northern Control Area, VORs are orientated to true north, instead of the normal magnetic north to aid pilots flying on grid. Shown as an example is Resolute Bay, Canada's most northerly town, which is on an island between Ellesmere Island and mainland Canada, about 600 nautical miles south of the magnetic North Pole, and with a variation of more than 31 degrees west. Because of the variety of navigational methods usable in the polar regions, it is very important that the systems are carefully monitored. Particular care is required when the autopilot is slave to one of the navigation systems, and position comparisons should be made frequently against an independent source of position information. For example, a comparison of an inertial navigation system with GPS, or GPS with a VOR DME position line. Care is also required if the autopilot is disengaged for any reason, for example turbulence, that the desired track is recaptured and maintained correctly when it is re-engaged. The gyro compasses may also need frequent realignment, depending on the type of gyro fitted, because of the prevalent high rates of earth rate and transport wonder in this area of the world. Other factors which contribute to the difficulties of polar navigation include radio communications, which are often limited to HF because of the long distances between stations, and the scarcity of ground-based navigation aids and en route alternate airfields, due to the remoteness, inhospitable terrain, and harsh climate. Transoceanic flight presents similar problems to flying over large areas of remote and sparsely populated land. That is, communication difficulties, because of a necessary reliance on HF radios, being out of VHF range, no radar, and no permanent radio navigation beacons. In addition, of course, oceans tend to be much larger than most remote land areas, and present very little opportunity of finding a place to land on solid ground in the event of an emergency, other than mid-ocean island groups such as the Azores and Ascension in the Atlantic, and the Hawaiian Islands and Polynesia in the Pacific. Such an event did actually occur in August 2001, when an Airbus 330 of Canadian carrier Air Transat, flying from Toronto to Lisbon, suffered a double flameout, that is, the loss of both engines, due to a fuel leak in the right engine, which was exacerbated by an attempt to rebalance the fuel by cross-feeding. This unfortunately pumped more fuel overboard, and resulted in the aircraft running out of fuel. But the captain, who had already initiated a low-fuel diversion to Lajes Air Force Base in the Azores, managed to glide the Airbus to a landing at Lajes, saving all 306 people on board, with only 18 minor injuries. The aircraft was only slightly damaged and was returned to service. As a footnote to this story, it is worth noting that the flight crew were criticised for not correctly diagnosing the original fault, the engine fuel leak, but praised for a remarkable piece of flying. The fuel leak was caused by an incorrect hydraulic part chafing through the adjacent fuel line, for which Air Transat took responsibility. Had the flight not been rerouted further south for traffic reasons, the aircraft would not have been able to glide to Lajes, and that is one link in the chain of events which prevented a tragedy. When flying in oceanic airspace, aircraft cannot be monitored by radar except close to land, and therefore air traffic control has to be procedural. This means that it is based on the flight being given a cleared route for the ocean crossing, with an entry time which is based on the estimate passed by the pilot when he requests his oceanic clearance, but which may be adjusted by the Oceanic Area Control Center, or OAC, depending on traffic. As part of procedural control, the pilot has to make position reports on HF radio to the appropriate OAC, or OACs if crossing a boundary, at each waypoint on his cleared route, typically every 10 degrees of longitude when flying east or west, or every 20 degrees of latitude above 70 degrees, giving actual time of arrival at the point, flight level, next waypoint and estimated time of arrival, and the next point on the route. Also included would be other information such as climb requests and mandatory reports of significant or severe weather, usually icing or turbulence. Because of the lack of weather observation stations, aircraft flying on random routes will add weather reports, consisting of ambient spot wind and outside air temperature, to the position report. Random routes means effectively most routes outside the organised track system, of which more will be covered in the following lessons. If a flight crew are unable to comply with their clearance for any reason, a revised clearance should be obtained where possible before any action is taken. There are, however, procedures laid down to ensure vertical and lateral separation in the event of such things as emergency descents if clearance cannot be obtained immediately. Oceanic routes will start at the boundary of an Oceanic Control Area, or OCA, at a point defined either by latitude and longitude or a waypoint name called an Oceanic Entry Point, possibly at the end of an airway, as with many of those for European boundary points. By international convention, the names all have 5 letters. Those off the Newfoundland and Labrador coast of Canada are named after fish and seafood, in deference to the local fishing industry, and are even referred to in publications as the fish points. Aircraft will also leave the OCA through recognised waypoints, referred to in this case as oceanic exit points. There are no permanent fixed routes like airways within oceanic airspace, other than a few special routes, usable under specific circumstances. Instead, waypoints inside the oceanic control areas will be defined by lat and long coordinates, usually whole or half degrees of latitude, and whole degrees of longitude every 10 degrees, or 20 degrees if above 70 degrees latitude, unless the route is defined by the organised track system, which will be described in a later lesson. The distance between lines of longitude 10 degrees apart will vary with track angle and latitude, but around 50 to 55 degrees north will be in the order of 350 nautical miles. Routes are flown along the arcs of great circles between waypoints, that is, the shortest distance, and the oceanic portion of a flight's route will normally be defined by the minimum time track, or MTT. The MTT is now invariably calculated by computer, to give a track which takes advantage of the wind structure along the route, using a database of both forecasts and observations to find a route which is not necessarily the shortest in distance, but which takes the least time, as its name implies. The computer will thus take advantage of tailwinds, but avoid headwinds as far as possible, either vertically or horizontally, to balance time against fuel consumption. A lower level at a slightly higher fuel burn rate may be better than going higher for better fuel rate, but into a stronger headwind. This lesson has given you an insight into the problems and considerations necessary for long-range flights in polar and oceanic regions. The busiest oceanic airspace in the world, which includes a polar region, is the North Atlantic. The special rules and procedures which apply to the area are covered in the next lesson, which in turn is followed by a short lesson on extended twin-engine operations.
The North Atlantic is the busiest oceanic airspace in the world. In 2007, there were about 425,000 flights across the pond, as it is known, and the volume of traffic continues to increase. This volume of traffic in an area where radar surveillance and VHF communications are largely unavailable, and the fact that the majority of travellers are business passengers whose travelling times tend to be concentrated into distinct periods of peak flow, a sort of aviation rush hour influenced by time zones, have led to the establishment of an area of special category airspace with its own rules in addition to the normal oceanic procedures. The oceanic airspace is Category A controlled airspace, extending vertically from flight level 55, 5,500 feet, and usable from flight level 60, or 2,000 feet above ground level, whichever is the higher, up to flight level 660, 66,000 feet. It is divided into Oceanic Control Areas, or OCAs, covering several areas spanning the Atlantic and extending from the North Pole to latitude 27 north. The areas are named after Reykjavik, Iceland, Buda, Norway, Shanwick, an amalgam of Shannon in Eire and Prestwick in Scotland, Gander, Newfoundland, New York, and Santa Maria, Azores. There is further oceanic airspace extending into the South Atlantic, but with only a fraction of the traffic density of the North Atlantic. The concentration of traffic in time, and both laterally, in the northern part of the area, and vertically, in the band roughly between 30 and 40,000 feet where jet aircraft can fly most efficiently, has led to the special airspace previously mentioned, which is called the Minimum Navigation Performance Specification Airspace, or MNPSA, which is described in the next part of the lesson. The Minimum Navigation Performance Specifications airspace was devised to cope with the demands on airspace peculiar to the North Atlantic, and is the result of an agreement between the states bordering the area to form the ICAO North Atlantic region, or NAT region, and within it the MNPSA, which has been in force since 1979. The area covered by the MNPSA is shown on the screen. The vertical limits of MNPSA are from flight level 285 to flight level 420, with usable levels 290 to 410. The MNPSA rules demand that aircraft intended to operate in the MNPSA are fitted with long-range navigational equipment which can guarantee the necessary degree of accuracy, both horizontally and vertically, to ensure safe separation between aircraft, and that the crews that fly them undergo special training. The inertial navigation system is an example of an acceptable long-range navigation system for use on the North Atlantic. Operators who require to fly aircraft in the MNPSA need to have their Air Operator's Certificate, or AOC, annotated to certify that their aircraft equipment and the crew procedures comply with the strict regulations of the MNPSA. There are several elements, both in aircraft fit and in procedures, which we will examine in this lesson, looking at the navigation equipment first. Aircraft must be fitted with at least 2 long-range navigation systems, which are capable of providing continuous position, track and speed information. The approved systems are a Global Navigation Satellite System, the only currently viable one being the Global Positioning System, widely known as GPS, an Inertial Navigation System, INS, and a system using the inputs from one or more inertial reference systems or any other sensor complying with the MNPS requirement. The requirement for 2 systems covers the possibility of failure in one of the systems, and each system must incorporate a failure warning light. With a triple INS fit, the 3 platforms compare readings to ensure use of the most accurate information. With twin INS, if one fails, a second source of information is needed to determine which of the 2 is the more accurate. In the event of a total navigation system failure, an emergency must be declared, and the appropriate procedures followed to maintain separation from other aircraft. For aircraft which are approved for operation to MNPS criteria, flight plans should include in Item 10, Equipment, the letter X. Under instrument flight rules in controlled airspace, the normal allocation of flight levels at and above flight level 290 is for eastbound aircraft to fly at 290, 330, 370 and 410, and for westbound aircraft to fly at 310, 350 and 390, so that aircraft are vertically separated by 2,000 feet. But this puts a heavy demand on the amount of space available at each flight level during peak traffic periods. The answer to the problem came in reducing the vertical spacing to 1,000 feet within the MNPSA, provided certain parameters were met by participating aircraft. Trials were started in 1997, and the full implementation of the Reduced Vertical Separation Minima, RVSM, occurred in 2002. In theory, all RVSM levels are available for eastbound and westbound flights, but North Atlantic flight planning will ensure that no 2 opposite direction aeroplanes share the same level. As with the MNPSA navigational criteria, aircraft and operators have to be certificated. The specific requirements are 2 independent barometric altimeters accurate to within 200 feet of each other, an autopilot height lock, an altitude alert system, secondary surveillance radar transponder with altitude reporting, Mode C, and TCAS-2, usually referred to as TCAS-2, the latest traffic alert and collision avoidance system. To prevent unnecessary TCAS warnings during RVSM operations, pilots should ensure that, when changing levels and within 1,500 feet of the new level, the rate of climb or descent is reduced to less than 1,500 feet per minute, and ideally between 500 and 1,000 feet per minute. For aircraft which are approved for operation to RVSM criteria, flight plans should include in Item 10, Equipment, the letter W. This on its own does not entitle access to the MNPSA. RVSM on its own would only give limited benefit, and to make the most of the airspace horizontally as well as vertically, the MNPSA makes use of a system which enables the best use of the routings available at peak periods without the use of ground-based navigation aids, but maintaining specified lateral separation. This is a major element of the MNPSA and is covered in the next part of this lesson. For crossing the North Atlantic, most flights would want to follow a Great Circle route with the best possible use of the winds, that is, a minimum time track. The majority of departure and destination airports are such that most flights would need to follow similar tracks. In addition, the favoured departure period for westbound flights is to leave in the morning to arrive in the USA or Canada in the middle of the day local time. Because the time zone change is reversed for eastbound flights, and a whole day would be lost with a morning departure, most business travellers will travel overnight to arrive in Europe in the morning. To accommodate this tidal flow of flights, all wishing to follow similar routes at similar flight levels at similar times, a set of generally parallel tracks is established with lateral separation based on MNPS criteria, and taking account of minimum time tracks as much as possible. An example of a daytime set of westbound tracks is illustrated. RVSM levels are used, but to make maximum use of the airspace, the tracks can be made one-way routes, both east and westbound levels being allocated to the track direction. This concept is called the Organised Track System, or OTS, the tracks themselves usually being referred to as NAT tracks, short for North Atlantic. Whilst the OTS seems to be a formal concept, use of NAT tracks is not mandatory, and an operator may plan any route required. Such routes are known as random routes and, at the times of activity of the OTS, are subject to certain restrictions which will be outlined later in this lesson. As already mentioned, there are two distinct traffic flows in the MNPSA and two OTSs to fit the demand, westbound during the day and eastbound at night. To avoid potential confliction between aircraft in opposite directions at the same level, it is necessary to have a buffer period between east and west NAT tracks being active to allow aircraft to complete their crossing before the tracks reverse. The OTS period is defined at 30 west, which is roughly the midpoint for most traffic, and a flight must plan to cross 30 west during the OTS period to be able to complete the NAT track portion of its route. The OTS periods at 30 west are 11:30 to 1900 UTC for the daytime westbound tracks, and 0100 to 0800 UTC for the nighttime eastbound tracks. The buffer or changeover periods are 0801 to 1129 and 1901 to 0059 UTC. Each of the NAT tracks is given a designator. For westbound tracks, the tracks are lettered from A for the most northerly track and sequentially southwards, as shown in the example on the screen. And for the eastbound tracks, they are lettered from Z for the most southerly track, then in reverse alphabetical order going north, as shown in this example of the nighttime NAT tracks. At set times each day, the airspace managers of the 5 OCAs in the MNPSA, with Met advisors, hold a conference to decide the following day's OTS structure. The Shanwick manager is then responsible for publishing the next daytime OTS, and the Gander manager publishes the next nighttime OTS. The westbound daytime message is issued at midnight UTC, and the eastbound nighttime message at 1200 UTC. And they are distributed to the parties concerned with transatlantic flights, such as domestic area control centres, aircraft operators, airport flight planning rooms, etc. The message, an example of which is shown on the screen, contains the date and validity period. And the routes, with designator letter and positions denoted by lat and long or 5-letter named waypoints. The lat and long points are in the format, for example, 59/10 for 59 north, 10 west. The second and third lines of the 5-line route block give the levels available. eastbound levels first, then westbound. In this case, eastbound levels are available for random flights only, but in practice are unlikely to be allocated. And flights on NAT Track A can use flight levels 310 to 360 inclusive at 1,000-foot spacing, plus flight level 390. The fourth and fifth lines denote the specified feeder routes between the oceanic entry and exit points and domestic airspace. In this case, the annotation EUR routes west nil indicates that no specific routes to the entry point are nominated in European airspace, and that the North American routes listed can be used to enter Canadian or US domestic airspace, as appropriate. At the end of the message, there will be remarks, including some standard reminders, navigation warnings, and the Track Message Identification, or TMI, which is a 3-digit number corresponding to the Julian date, the 1st of January being 001 and 31st of December being 365, or 366 in a leap year. Random routes, as mentioned earlier, are routes within the MNPSA which only follow part of a NAT track in the organised track system if going in the same direction, or follow a reciprocal route, or cross or avoid NAT tracks altogether. If the route is planned to use only part of a NAT track, the route is considered a random route. Operators can plan any required route, but need to consider the implications, particularly if the route is coincident with part of the OTS. It would be appropriate to choose flight levels not nominated in the track message, and, if part of the route is along the OTS, then the outer routes, that is, the northernmost or southernmost of the group, should be used. Ultimately, the Oceanic Area Control Centres, OACs, will apply whatever restrictions are necessary to protect the OTS traffic, so careful planning of random routes could avoid lengthy reroutes or flight at uneconomical flight levels. Occasionally, aircraft that cannot comply with the MNPS criteria for long-range navigation systems may need to fly through the MNPSA. For such events, special routes known as the Blue Spruce, M3 and M11 have been devised and established that enable aircraft to cross the North Atlantic with near-continuous cover of VOR and ADF navigation beacon information. The tracks shown on the map on screen offer minimum open ocean crossing, routing via Labrador, southern Greenland and Iceland using their short-range navigation systems, such as VOR, DME and ADF. On these special routes, VHF communication can be used, and diversion and refuelling facilities at the few en route airfields, such as Sondrestrom Air Force Base, Narsarsuaq in Greenland, Reykjavik and Keflavik Air Force Base in Iceland, are available. The routes are obviously longer and less fuel efficient than direct routes, but offer safer options for shorter range, non-scheduled and general aviation traffic, such as light aircraft on delivery flights. On the eastern edge of the Shanwick OCA to the west of the British Isles and France are 3 areas known as Oceanic Transition Areas, the Northern, Shannon and Brest OTAs. These are part of the OCA and have the same vertical dimension as the rest of the OCA, but air traffic services are provided by Shannon Control in the NOTAR and SOTAR, and by Brest Control in the BOTAR. MNPSA rules and criteria still apply in the 3 OTAs between flight levels 285 and 420, and the purpose of the airspace is to allow transition from domestic to oceanic levels and vice versa. In the days of Concorde and supersonic travel, it was also used to accelerate to and decelerate from over Mach 2. Concorde flew well above MNPSA and is the reason why oceanic airspace goes as high as it does. This part of the lesson will deal with voice communication. Some aspects will apply to all oceanic areas, but we will concentrate on the NAT region. Because of the distances involved, the primary method of communication is by high-frequency single sideband, abbreviated to HF-SSB, or more usually just referred to as HF. Long-range VHF is available within 250 miles of land, and VHF is used on a dedicated frequency to deliver oceanic clearance before aircraft enter the OCA. There is also an air-to-air frequency, 123.45, to allow aircraft with comms or navigation problems to talk to other aircraft or relay messages. All aircraft also have to monitor the emergency frequency, 121.5. HF comms can cover very long ranges, as can be seen from the Pacific coverage chart illustrated, but the reception range and quality can vary greatly with time of day, frequency and even weather, since the ionosphere plays an important role in signal propagation. There could be a large amount of background noise and interference which makes a listening watch unpleasant and fatiguing. The HF frequency band is between 3 and 30 MHz, and all the agencies in a region will operate on the same set of frequencies, a system used in all aeronautical HF networks. The NAT region has 6 frequency groups, NAT-A to NAT-F, to cover various parts of the region, some also covering peripheral radio stations as well as the primary OCAs. This means that an aircraft can not only transmit to 2 agencies at once, but the ground station can also hear and talk to each other as is necessary, for example during a boundary crossing position report or for relaying messages. The OCAs also have landline data links. As the OCAs are a procedural environment, position reports have to be made in a standard format, normally every 10 degrees of longitude, but should any reported ETA change by 3 minutes or more, the Oceanic Area Control Center, OACC, must be informed. Listening to HF continuously with all its inherent background noise and atmospheric interference is very fatiguing and detracts from other flight deck responsibilities. To avoid the need to listen out, a system called SELCAL, from selective calling, was devised. Each aircraft has its own 4-letter code, which, when transmitted by the ground station operator on the HF frequency in use, triggers a flashing light, usually blue, on the flight deck to alert the crew that they are being called. A 2-note tone can also be heard on the frequency if the crew are listening at the time. On initial contact with the OACC, and on any subsequent frequency change, the crew will ask for a SELCAL check, giving the aircraft's 4-letter code. The ground controller will then send the code which should activate the warning light. The crew acknowledge a successful check and will then be instructed to maintain a SELCAL watch. This fulfills the Class A airspace requirement for a listening watch with ATC. The first check must be done at or just prior to entering the OCA. SELCAL is also available on the long-range VHF frequencies, and the first check can be done on VHF. In the NAT region, the Secondary Surveillance Radar SSR code, assigned by a Domestic Air Traffic Control Unit, must be maintained for 30 minutes after entering the OCA, and then changed to Alpha 2000. In the event of an emergency, radio failure or unlawful interference, the appropriate code should be set, regardless of whether the aircraft is within range of a ground radar unit. To maintain longitudinal, that is, fore and aft separation, between aircraft flying the same NAT track at the same level, the OCA will apply a minimum time separation of 10 minutes, based on the required navigation performance accuracy of 20 nautical miles, referred to as RNP20. Today's long-range navigation systems are far more accurate than that, and easily exceeded the statistical tracking accuracy of 12.6 miles, calculated before the advent of satellite navigation, used to determine MNPSA criteria. To maintain this separation, however, it is necessary that aircraft fly at the same speed, so crews have to ensure that they maintain a given Mach number during the time spent in the MNPSA, which could be as long as 5 hours. Lateral separation is achieved by the OTS track structure itself, since the tracks are spaced by a minimum of 1 degree of latitude on east-west tracks, that is, at least 60 miles. This allows aircraft to be laterally separated when 20 miles from their reported position, plus a buffer of 20 miles. As an aircraft approaches landfall, the crew must confirm the aircraft's position by reference to a land-based navigation beacon. If this position is more than 25 nautical miles laterally off track, this is regarded as a gross navigation error, or GNE, which means that lateral separation may have been compromised by inaccurate navigation. Such errors have to be reported. The value for a gross navigation error is arrived at by doubling the statistical required navigation performance figure of 12.6 miles, giving approximately 25 miles. Pilots are routinely warned in track messages that GNEs are usually associated with revised routing, so extra vigilance is required in these circumstances. Before entering an OCA, an aircraft must have a clearance to do so. The crew must obtain the clearance from the OAC at least 40 minutes before entry. Since all the entry points are within 250 miles of land, clearances can normally be obtained on one of the dedicated VHF clearance frequencies. Alternatively, the long-range VHF frequency could be used, or failing that, the Oceanic HF network. Or if direct contact is not possible, the clearance could be requested through the domestic ATC. If the aircraft's point of departure is less than 40 minutes from the OCA boundary, then the oceanic clearance would have to be obtained on the ground. At airports where this is normal procedure, the OAC has a transmitter in the vicinity, as at Dublin, Shannon and Prestwick. The clearance will include the clearance limit, usually the destination, the track identification letter and entry point, the initial flight level, the Mach number required, and any special instructions, such as primary and secondary HF frequencies. The clearance must be read back, but an abbreviated clearance can be made if the NAT track letter and 3-digit track message identifier replace the full route details. If the pilot omits the track code letter and TMI, then a full read-through and readback of the route are required. Shanwick OAC will not allow entry unless the clearance has been confirmed. In the event of a loss of ability to maintain the normal criteria in the MNPSA, the OAC should be informed, but in the event of loss of contact, there are several ways in which messages may be passed, principally relays on the air-to-air frequency of 123.45, but also on the emergency frequency 121.5. Both of these frequencies are monitored by all aircraft in the MNPSA. This method of relaying through other aircraft is also the normal technique to be used in the event of loss of HF communications. Aircraft equipped with satellite communications, or SATCOM, can, if all other methods fail and only in the Shanwick OCA, contact Shanwick by SATCOM. The procedure to be followed in the event of a total loss of communication will depend on where the failure occurs. If the aircraft has not entered the NAT region, it is recommended that the pilot follows national procedures and lands at a suitable airport. However, if he elects to continue, it must be in accordance with his oceanic clearance. If no clearance has been received and acknowledged, he must enter the OCA as per his flight plan and maintain the speed and level until landfall. If the aircraft is already in the OCA, it should continue as cleared to the oceanic exit point or landfall. On entering domestic airspace, the flight should be continued in accordance with the appropriate national communications failure procedure. If an in-flight emergency arises or an aeroplane is unable to adhere to its clearance or flight level in MNPSA, pilots must follow the contingency procedure. The procedure requires the pilot to turn the aeroplane right or left at least 45 degrees, parallel the original track by 15 nautical miles, and, if above flight level 410, climb or descend 1,000 feet, and if below flight level 410, climb or descend 500 feet. If the aeroplane is at flight level 410, The pilot can climb the aeroplane 1,000 feet or descend 500 feet. These procedures are designed to place the affected aeroplane safely separated from other traffic in the MNPSA. Before commencing a diversion across the flow of adjacent traffic, aeroplanes should, whilst maintaining the 15 nautical miles offset track, expedite a climb or descent below the vast majority of NATS traffic, which is above flight level 410 or below flight level 285. The aeroplane should then maintain a flight level that differs from those normally used by 1,000 feet if above flight level 410, or by 500 feet if below flight level 410. However, if the pilot is unable or unwilling to carry out a major climb or descent, then any diversion should be carried out at a level 500 feet different from those in use within MNPS airspace, until a new ATC clearance is obtained. A lot of aeroplanes flying in MNPSA have triple navigation systems which provide plenty of redundancy, but a problem could arise when only two systems are fitted. Aeroplanes equipped with only two long-range navigation systems are subject to certain restrictions after a failure of one or both systems. Should one system fail before takeoff, the pilot must consider either delaying departure until a repair is possible, or obtain a clearance to fly above or below MNPS airspace. The pilot could also consider planning on the special routes where short-range navigation facilities, such as VOR, DME, can be used. If one navigation system fails before the aeroplane reaches the OCA boundary, the pilot can consider landing at a suitable aerodrome or returning to the departure aerodrome. The pilot could also consider obtaining a reclearance above or below MNPS airspace, or to divert to use one of the special routes. If one navigation system fails once the aeroplane has entered the OCA, the pilot should normally continue to operate in accordance with the clearance already received, appreciating that the reliability of the total navigation system has been reduced. The pilot should assess and monitor the performance of the remaining system for the remaining portion of the flight in MNPS airspace. He may propose to ATC to fly above or below MNPS levels, turn back or divert to one of the special routes. If an aircraft on a NATS track encounters wake turbulence, the pilot can follow the standard strategic lateral offset procedure, or SLOP, designed initially to mitigate the risk of vertical navigation errors. Provided his aircraft is equipped to fly automatic offsets, he can fly either on 1 or 2 nautical miles right of track to avoid the vortex. If this does not put him upwind of the turbulence, he should contact the aircraft ahead on 123.45, request that he adopt an offset instead to resolve the problem. Contacting the preceding or following aircraft is at the pilot's discretion. Wake turbulence in the MNPSA is reportable to the North Atlantic Central Monitoring Agency. Of the errors associated with oceanic clearances, the two most significant are ATC system loop errors and waypoint insertion errors. An ATC system loop error is any error caused by misunderstanding between pilot and controller regarding flight level, Mach number, or route. For example, if a pilot mishears his clearance, reads it back incorrectly, and the controller fails to notice the mistake. Errors of this kind could cause significant problems, but are likely to be found and corrected during position reporting. Waypoint insertion errors are the cause of many track-keeping deviations. As the name implies, they are the result of incorrect data being entered and not correctly checked, or a failure to cross-check navigation systems, particularly after a change to the expected route. A major advance in oceanic communications and airspace management has been the advent of data link technology, which is now available to suitably equipped aircraft. Flights can now receive their clearance and make automatic position reports through their flight management system, provided permission is granted by the Oceanic Control Center. Controller Pilot Data Link Communications, or CPDLC, was introduced in the late 1990s in the South Pacific, later being extended to the North Atlantic, and uses the Aircraft Communication Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS, principally with satellite communication. It offers greater reliability, flexibility and ease of use for both pilots and controllers alike, and consequently a great improvement in safe oceanic flight in an area which is subject to the many regulations and procedures necessitated by its status as the busiest oceanic airspace in the world. In this lesson, we have covered all the basic knowledge required for operations across the North Atlantic, and in particular the area known as the Minimum Navigation Performance Specific Airspace. The detailed knowledge is contained in the NAT MNPSA manual, which is used by all operators flying across the North Atlantic.
In this lesson, you will learn about the reasons behind the establishment of ETOPS, which is the acronym for Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, and the basic rules and conditions which permit twin-engined airliners to operate beyond the ranges based on flight time on one engine, which used to be considered safe for diversion in the event of engine failure. In the early days of post-Second World War airline development, when all airliners were piston-engined, it was considered unsafe for twin-engined aircraft to fly routes that were beyond 60 minutes flying time from a suitable diversion airfield in case of engine failure. As jet-powered airliners were developed and entered service, they proved more reliable than piston aircraft, but were still restricted to a 1-hour diversion by the American FAA, although ICAO regulations allowed for 90 minutes. In the 1970s, as the first twin high-bypass turbofan airliners entered service, it soon became apparent that their extra power and economy enabled them to rival the current three-engined wide-body jets. It was the proven reliability of the engines, though, that led to the establishment of ETOPS. Initially, in 1985, the FAA approved guidelines for the granting of a 120-minute diversion time sufficient for direct transatlantic flight. The first ETOPS rating for the Atlantic was awarded to TWA, initially for a 90-minute diversion time, but which was extended to 120 minutes after operational evaluation. In 1988, the 120-minute ETOPS limit was made extendable to 180 minutes, subject to stringent technical and operational conditions. The ETOPS 180 regulation was first used operationally in 1989 and was also adopted by the Joint Aviation Authority in Europe, the JAA, now EASA, the ICAO and other regulatory bodies. It is based on the premise that there will not be an engine shutdown more than twice in 100,000 engine hours. Statistics have shown that turbines are extremely reliable components, and that the engine ancillaries, such as pumps, control systems, etc., are more likely to fail. For this reason, engines may have duplex systems, which can give them the required reliability rating. Alternatively, aircraft can be fitted with an auxiliary power unit, APU, and a ram air turbine, or RAT, to provide bleed air and electrical and hydraulic power. On the North Atlantic, which is covered by ETOPS 120, some diversion airfields, particularly in Iceland and Greenland, are subject to sudden changes of weather in winter, which render them unusable as diversions. To allow for this, the JAA gave a 15% extension to the 120 minutes, giving 138 minutes diversion time when these airports were closed. Various ETOPS ratings are awarded to both aircraft types and airlines, depending on their capabilities and operation, and subject to approval tests. An operator must have operational certification and type approval before carrying out ETOPS flights, and are also required to carry out reliability programs on equipment. An ETOPS 180 with 15% extension to 207 minutes covers 95% of the Earth's surface. But some areas, such as the Antarctic and some areas of the Southern Oceans, are still excluded from twin-engine operations. There are pressures on authorities in some parts of the world to grant temporary case-by-case extensions to 240 minutes diversion time. but 4 hours on one engine is a long time, and the establishing of adequate reliability would require a substantial amount of statistical proof. This lesson covers the subject of the removal and prevention of contaminants, such as ice, snow, slush and frost, from aeroplane surfaces prior to flight, in associated weather conditions. Any accumulation of ice, frost or snow on an aircraft, and particularly on the flying surfaces, that is, the wings and tail unit, can have a severely detrimental effect on an aeroplane's ability to fly as expected, or indeed at all. The Potomac River crash of January 1982, in which 4 people on the ground and 74 people in the aircraft died, and only 5 on board survived, is a sobering reminder of what can go wrong if proper procedures and techniques are not used in such situations. The Air Florida Boeing 737, delayed by a snowstorm over Washington, was inadequately de-iced, and attempted to take off with snow still falling and not fully cleared from the wings, and without the engine ice protection on. It took almost the full length of the runway to take off, but never got properly airborne, reaching only 350 feet. 30 seconds after liftoff, it stalled and hit a bridge over the Potomac River, killing 4 people stuck in traffic, broke up, and crashed into the ice-covered river less than a mile from Washington National Airport. As with most accidents, the crash was the result of several factors. In this case, the weather was the initial cause, but exacerbated by delays and failures by both ground staff and flight crew. The ground de-icing crew used incorrectly maintained and modified equipment and non-standard procedures, and the captain made a series of errors of procedure and ill-judged handling decisions. The captain also ignored warnings from his co-pilot, which, had he heeded them, would have avoided the crash, as would any break in the chain of events. Remember that any surface contamination must be removed before flight, and the correct procedures followed according to the conditions. Ice, snow or frost on an aircraft will have several effects. All deposits, of course, require temperatures at or below 0 degrees Celsius to persist, and the nature of the effect will cause a serious reduction of aeroplane performance. The aerodynamic effects of airframe contamination are to change both the shape and surface texture of the wings and tail unit. Lift can be reduced by 30% or more, and drag increased by as much as 40%. Such changes will increase stalling speeds, reduce controllability, and alter handling characteristics. You will be flying an aircraft with a wing of unknown and variable aerofoil section and untested behaviour. Any deposit of snow, ice or frost will increase the aircraft's mass, and can also affect the centre of gravity. A mass increase will increase stalling speeds. A change in centre of gravity will affect stability, and may also increase stalling speeds. Do not be deceived by such misconceptions as the snow will blow off the wings during the takeoff run. It doesn't, as pilots who have tried this dubious method of snow clearance have found to their cost. Ice build-up on windscreens can obscure vision, and on radio aerials can disrupt communications. Operation of undercarriage and flaps can be affected by water freezing in landing gear and doors and in flap tracks. Functional and indication faults can be caused by frozen microswitches, as illustrated on the screen. Ice forming on or in pitot tubes, static vents, and angle of attack vanes can cause erroneous readings or indications of speed, altitude, rate of climb or descent, or angle of attack. Affected air data systems giving engine power information would also give incorrect readings, as was the case in the Air Florida accident. Engines themselves, and not only their indications, can also be affected by icing. Ice formed on and in intakes can break off and be ingested, causing damage to fan and compressor blades, and ice accretion on the blades would reduce engine efficiency, and may even cause compressor stall. Piston engines can be affected by carburetor icing, which can occur at temperatures well above zero. As we have mentioned before, any deposits of ice, snow or frost must be removed before flight. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, have defined in their document 9640 what is known as the clean aircraft concept, which states that during conditions that are conducive to the formation of aircraft ice during ground operations, a commander shall not attempt to take off unless the external surfaces are clear of any deposits of ice which may adversely affect the performance of the aircraft. The commander shall not fly the aircraft if icing is expected, and the aircraft is not certificated for flight where icing is expected. Guidance on procedures can be found in the ICAO Operations Manual. Part A includes ground procedures, and Part B contains procedures for flight in known icing conditions. It is worth defining at this stage the two categories of ice protection: de-icing and anti-icing. De-icing involves the removal of deposits of ice, snow or frost which have already formed on the aircraft, and anti-icing involves processes which prevent the formation of such deposits. There are several approved methods of clearing ice or snow contamination. The most widely used and the most dependable is the application of de-icing fluid, either from special vehicles or, more rarely, from taxi-through spray bays. The airframe can be warmed with hot air blowers. Or, more suitable for smaller aircraft, surfaces can be manually swept of light accumulations of frost, snow or ice. Additionally, there are in service a small number of a taxi-through system, which uses infrared heat to disperse ice and snow. Next, you will learn in more detail about the de-icing procedures. Ground de-icing and anti-icing can be either a one-stage or two-stage procedure. The single step consists of the application of a combined de-icing and anti-icing fluid, which removes frozen deposits and protects the cleared surfaces from further accumulations for a limited time. There are three types of combined fluid, all of which are normally applied heated, either neat or diluted with hot water. The thickened fluids are designed to stick to the airframe long enough to prevent deposits forming, but to have been dispersed by the airflow on reaching around 100 knots on the takeoff roll. The two-stage procedure involves first the removal of ice, frost or snow, and then an anti-icing process. The fluids for both processes have what is known as a holdover time, which is the length of time an aircraft can wait until takeoff before needing retreatment. It is dependent on mixture strength, airframe temperature and weather conditions, particularly the ambient temperature and type and severity of expected contaminant, for example, frost, heavy snow and freezing rain. The holdover time for a one-step procedure will start from the very beginning, and for a two-step procedure it will start from the commencement of the anti-icing procedure. The de-icing operators should inform the flight crew of the type of fluid, the dilution proportions, and the time at which application started, to enable the crew to check the holdover time. These three pieces of information form what is known as the anti-icing code. The aircraft should be ready for departure before expiry of the holdover time. If it is not, then the de-icing and anti-icing procedure should be repeated if conditions dictate and a contamination hazard still exists. It is important to note that the holdover time and protection will be shortened and may go below the lowest range in cases of heavy precipitation rates, high moisture content, high wind velocity, and jet or prop blast from preceding aeroplanes whilst taxiing. In this lesson, we have covered the types of contamination that can build up on aeroplane surfaces on the ground, and how they can seriously reduce performance if they are not removed prior to takeoff. In addition, we have looked at the various treatments used for removal and prevention of contamination, and why the flight crew must be aware of the treatment and holdover times. In extreme weather conditions, it is important for all concerned when preparing aeroplanes for departure that the clean aeroplane concept is adopted. In this lesson, you will learn about the risks posed to aircraft by collision with birds, and the methods and procedures which have been developed both to minimise the likelihood of bird strikes and to make pilots aware of the types and locations of potential hazards. Since aircraft started to share the air with birds, the risk of collision has existed. The first recorded bird strike happened in 1905, when Orville Wright, whilst practising flying in circles, chased a flock of birds and killed one, which fell on the upper wing but fell off after a while when he banked more steeply. It is not recorded which was travelling faster, the bird or the Wright flyer. The first human fatality occurred in 1912, when pioneer Cal Rogers was drowned after a gull jammed his control cables and his aircraft crashed into the sea off Long Beach, California. The risk has grown greatly with the increase in civil, military and private aviation activity, and particularly commercial flying, since the end of the Second World War. However, statistically, only a very small percentage of bird strikes result in human fatalities, and only about 10 to 15% cause damage to the aircraft. It is difficult to be exact about these figures, as many minor bird strikes go unreported, or even unnoticed. Bird strikes can inflict structural damage to airframes and engines to the extent of causing power loss or even engine failure. Jet engines are particularly vulnerable, having large intakes and rows of fan and compressor blades. A bird strike on a windscreen or on the nose of the aircraft, even if it may cause no physical damage, will probably deposit bird remains, obscuring pilots' vision. Prevention of bird strikes can be greatly helped by knowledge of bird habits, especially migration routes and seasons, and by observation of concentrations of birds near airfields. Such observations can be passed to air traffic control units, who can relay warnings to other aircraft. On a broader view, prevention can come into two categories: either keeping the birds away from the aircraft, bird management or control, or the aircraft away from the birds, aircraft flight path management. Bird management can be achieved in several ways, and airfield managers can select the measures which best suit their location and situation. Ways of reducing an airport's attractiveness to birds as a habitat could include reducing roosting sites such as groups of trees and eliminating sources of food, for example, seed-bearing grasses, bushes, or shrubs with fruits and berries. Trials have also shown successfully that leaving grass long on airfields will deter birds from landing in large numbers, as short grass makes for easier landing and a better view of any surface or airborne threat. Rubbish tips and landfill sites are very attractive to birds, particularly seagulls, and therefore their location near an airfield would create a significant hazard. Noise and lights can also be used to scare birds temporarily and encourage them to stay away. Bird control units, mobile air traffic control, or airport fire service staff can use pyrotechnics or loud broadcasts of bird distress calls. However, birds do become accustomed to these disturbances, so a change of method may be required from time to time. Successful use has also been made of dogs, particularly border collies, a widely used sheepdog breed, and of birds of prey, which are a very good deterrent to many species of birds. If it is not practical to try to move the birds from an area, for example in the case of a coastal airfield, then flight paths can be adapted to avoid the birds as much as possible. Departure routes will normally be designed to avoid known bird concentrations, And noise abatement procedures have the added benefit of a rapid initial climb, since most bird strikes occur below about 3,000 feet. It is interesting to note that on migratory routes during the spring and autumn, when bird transits are at their height, the number of bird strikes above 500 feet is much greater at night than during daylight. Use of aircraft lights can help birds detect and avoid aircraft in this situation. When birds sense a threat or approaching object, and this is usually by seeing it, they will tend to evade downwards, so pilots should be prepared to pull up. The kinetic energy generated by a bird hitting an aircraft varies with the mass of the bird and the square of the speed of impact. The more significant factor is the speed, so pilots should slow down if possible. The same is true of engine speed. So to minimize engine damage, RPM should be reduced if there is time to do so, and speed and phase of flight permit. The density of the bird is also a factor in the severity of damage caused. To sum up the foregoing, the collision speed is the most important factor in bird strike damage, followed by the mass of the bird. Aircraft and engine speed reduction can thus reduce potential damage. In the early days of the use of jet and turboprop engines, there were several serious accidents involving engine damage, and it was realized that engines and other forward-facing components, such as windscreens, had to be more impact-resistant. Improvements in fan blade design and materials made it possible to build engines that could take the impact of a 4-pound bird and be shut down safely, which is now the regulation industry standard. This resistance to impact standard is also applied to other parts of the aircraft. For most areas of the airframe, the 4-pound standard applies, but the empennage or tail unit must resist an 8-pound impact. Despite these improvements, multiple bird strikes are capable of disabling engines and other aircraft systems. The best-known such incident in recent times occurred in January 2009, when an Airbus A320 of US Airways, departing from New York's LaGuardia Airport, hit a flock of Canada geese at 3,200 feet and lost both engines. Unable to glide back to either of the airports in the vicinity, the captain, a safety expert, glider pilot, and a former fighter pilot, made a successful landing on the Hudson River in a brilliant piece of flying. All 150 passengers and 5 crew were safely rescued from the floating aircraft. Since 1980, ICAO has operated its Bird Strike Information Service, or IBIS, to record and collate data on bird strikes. In the first 15 years, over 62,000 strikes were recorded. And the system continues to amass data on the effects of bird activity on aircraft in order to improve prevention measures and reduce the number, risk, and cost of bird strikes. Under EU ETOPS regulations, any bird hazard or actual bird strike must be reported immediately to ATC. If a persistent hazard is apparent, it can be retransmitted to other aircraft or added as information in the Automatic Terminal Information Service or ATIS broadcast if the airfield has one. Regular and expected passages of large number of birds, as occurs at migration periods, would be notified in bird NOTAMs, or bird TAMs as they are known. Despite all the preventative measures, bird strikes will inevitably still happen. In the UK, it is mandatory to report them to the Civil Aviation Authority, whether or not damage has been caused. And even if a bird strike only becomes apparent after flight from evidence on the airframe. A written report on the appropriate form, depending on location, must be completed after flight, giving such information as aircraft operator, type and registration, airfield and runway, weather, height and speed, phase of flight, damage, effect on flight, and number and species of birds if known. Bird remains can even be submitted for identification if the species is not recognised. The CAA Bird Strike Occurrence Form, Form CA1282, is available online, and the information submitted helps to add to the knowledge base and thus improve bird strike prevention measures. In summary, it can be said that while the risk of bird strikes and the damage caused can be much reduced, and bird populations around airfields managed to a certain degree, there will always be a risk of bird strike, as it is impossible to regulate wild creatures, particularly in 3 dimensions, and bird strikes will continue to happen. Thorough training in emergency procedures, both of aircrew and ground staff, can mitigate the effects of a serious bird strike, and accurate reporting of incidents can help in devising techniques and procedures for prevention. This lesson will cover the requirements for noise abatement procedures and the means by which these requirements are achieved. The current generation of turbofan engines are considerably quieter in operation than their predecessors, thanks to technological improvements. Nevertheless, the disturbance caused by aircraft noise is still a sensitive subject, particularly to those who live or work close to busy airfields, and especially in the areas beneath the departure and arrival routes. In an effort to reduce the effects of aircraft noise, ETOPS regulations require that procedures are established by operators for IFR operations in accordance with the ICAO PANS OPS document 8168. Each state has to detail noise abatement procedures for each airfield in the Aeronautical Information Publication, or AIP, the procedures being principally designed for turbojet aircraft, although propeller-driven aircraft, both piston and turboprop, are sometimes specified in the procedures. On a point of terminology, it is worth mentioning that the expression noise amelioration, from the Latin for better, is increasingly being used. However, since the UK AIP still uses abatement at the time of writing, we will go along with that. The procedures will consist of any or all of the following elements. First, the use of noise preferential runways. Secondly, the use of noise preferential routes. And thirdly, the use of noise abatement takeoff and climb or approach procedures. In addition to these airfield-related procedures, each aircraft type will have its own procedure, devised by the operators and manufacturer and agreed by the state authority. These will include performance-related power reduction and flap retraction heights and speeds, maximum body angles, or climb attitudes. Noise preferential runway procedures involve the use of specified takeoff or landing directions which are nominated to avoid noise-sensitive areas. Runways will not normally be chosen for landing unless they have suitable glide path guidance, usually an ILS for use in poor weather, and precision approach path indicators, or PAPIs, in visual conditions. There are certain conditions under which a noise preferential runway will not be selected, namely if the runway surface is contaminated by snow, slush ice or water, if the crosswind or tailwind components, including gusts, exceed 15 or 5 knots respectively, when wind shear is reported or forecast, or thunderstorms are expected to affect the area, or when the visibility is less than 1900 metres, or the cloud base for landing is lower than 500 feet. Noise preferential routes are established to ensure that departing and arriving aircraft avoid flying over noise-sensitive areas near airfields as much as possible. There are strict parameters which apply to the use of turns in noise preferential routes, principally to avoid manoeuvres which could be hazardous close to the ground. Therefore, noise preferential routes will not include a turn below an aircraft height of 500 feet or 150 metres above ground or obstacles throughout the turn. Aircraft would not have to exceed 15 degrees of bank, unless there is provision in the procedure for acceleration, which would allow for an increase in bank angle. Turns would not be required to be made at the same time as a noise abatement power reduction. There must be adequate navigational guidance to allow pilots to follow the route as published. This guidance would normally be from VOR DME radio beacons in the form of bearings and distances, but could include radar monitoring. The noise abatement regulations for turns after takeoff and obstacle clearance, laid down in PANS OPS Volume 2, permit turns at 400 feet or 120 meters, with terrain clearance of at least 300 feet or 90 meters. The safety criteria of standard departure and standard arrival routes concerning climb gradients and obstacle clearance will be taken into consideration when the preferential routes are established, and aircraft will not be diverted from their assigned route unless either it is at an altitude above the upper noise abatement limit, or a deviation is essential for safety reasons. In designing the routes, aerodrome operators have to specify the noise abatement objectives, but it is the aviation authority of the state in which the airfield is located who are responsible for ensuring that they do so. Likewise, the state of an aircraft operator is responsible for the approval of any associated safe flight procedures developed by the operator. Where noise abatement procedures exist, they will only be used if there is some benefit to be expected. Notwithstanding this limitation, a pilot in command has the authority to decide not to carry out a procedure if he feels it would not be safe to do so. Also, procedures involving reduced power takeoffs should not be used in the adverse weather conditions previously described in the section on noise preferential runways, namely runway contamination, crosswind, tailwind, wind shear, thunderstorms, and poor visibility or low cloud base. Noise abatement climb procedures are planned according to a number of parameters. The first and basic one is that no procedure should start below 800 feet, or 240 meters above the airfield. Where an operator specifies a particular procedure for an aircraft, it will apply to all aerodromes. There can be no more than 2 climb procedures for any aircraft type, that is, one normal and one for noise abatement. A rider to any procedure is that, in the event of engine failure, power settings can be whatever is required by the pilot, and noise abatement considerations no longer apply. For noise abatement, the minimum thrust for the climb, with flaps and slats deployed, will be the lesser of maximum climb power and that required to maintain the engine outnet climb gradient. The thrust levels for various conditions and configuration would be found in the operations manual, and take account of the use, when appropriate, of engine anti-icing, which reduces engine power. All procedures must comply with the normal minimum climb gradient based on the obstacle data, all of which will be available to the operator, but the procedure should not demand a body angle or pitch attitude that exceeds the aircraft's acceptable maximum. Having looked at these parameters, you will be shown in the next scene how they are applied to 2 typical climb profiles. The diagram shown on the screen shows a typical noise abatement profile in which the aim is to alleviate noise close to the aerodrome. After takeoff, the aircraft accelerates to V2, plus a safety margin of 10 to 20 knots, and climbs to 800 feet above the airfield. V2 is takeoff safety speed, the speed above which the aircraft is controllable in the event of an engine failure. The extra speed keeps the body angle below maximum, while still enabling a good rate and angle of climb. At or above 800 feet, power will be reduced to the noise abatement setting, but flaps and slats will be left in the takeoff position to maintain the extra lift, with speed maintained at V2 plus 10 to 20 knots. Above 3,000 feet, the aircraft continues the climb and accelerates to en route climb speed, retracting flaps and slats at the appropriate speeds. The second profile shows a climb intended to alleviate noise distant from the aerodrome. The first segment to 800 feet is identical to that of the first profile. In the second segment, either the aircraft climbs, accelerating towards VZF, minimum speed with zero flap, and reducing power as flaps are retracted, or alternatively retracts the flaps and then continues the climb, reducing power and climbing at VZF plus 10 to 20 knots. Above 3,000 feet, the aircraft would then accelerate to its en route climb speed. For noise abatement approach procedures, two basic parameters are applied, namely that the aircraft will be in the landing configuration from the earlier of 5 nautical miles from the runway threshold or the ILS outer marker, and that no excessive rates of descent will be required. There are several safety considerations to be taken into account regarding glide path angle, which should not be above the ILS or Precision Approach Radar or PAR glide path, above the PAPI visual glide path, or above 3 degrees, unless the ILS glide path is higher. Note that the PAR talkdown mentioned in these restrictions is available in the UK only at certain military airfields. Noise abatement restrictions should not require a turn onto final approach at a distance less than that which, on a visual approach, would allow an adequately stabilised descent to the threshold. For an instrument approach, the aircraft should be established on the final approach track before intercepting the glide path. A procedure that has been quite widely adopted is the stabilised approach, which is shown on the screen. A continuous descent is flown from the initial approach fix, and gear and flaps are left up till late in the procedure, just before reaching the 5-mile point. This type of technique not only reduces the noise footprint of the aircraft, as it requires a more constant and lower power at higher altitudes until intercepting the final 5 miles or so of the approach, but also has the benefit of saving a fair amount of fuel over a period of time. For landing, noise abatement procedures do not prevent the use of reverse thrust and reverse pitch, although individual local procedures may request the minimum use of reverse. Also, displaced landing thresholds should only be used for noise abatement if aircraft performance requirements can be met on the reduced runway length. Noise abatement procedures are designed to minimize the impact of aircraft noise on areas surrounding airfields, but safety is always of paramount importance. Although the procedure parameters are laid down with this in mind, a pilot in command always has the authority to discontinue a noise abatement procedure, to follow an alternate normal one, or use whatever power settings he deems fit, if he feels that safety considerations so dictate. Fire on board an aircraft is fortunately a very rare occurrence, considering the potential hazards of a machine carrying and burning large quantities of volatile combustible liquid, either aviation gasoline, avgas, or jet fuel, and having a large, complex, and often heavily loaded electrical system. It is thanks to the technology developed and improved over the years that the current level of fire protection allows passengers and crew to travel in safety. Manufacturers are required to build in fire and smoke detection and suppression systems to cover engines and certain cabin and cargo areas, and include in the aircraft manuals full directions for their operation and use. These procedures will be included in the checklists, and crews need to be well practiced in both normal and emergency drills. The nature of the drills will be largely determined by whether the aircraft is airborne or on the ground. and if on the ground, whether it is moving or stationary, empty or full of passengers, close to other aircraft, or isolated. On the airfield, of course, the crew can call, through ATC, on the aerodrome fire services for assistance. Larger airfields will even have a radio frequency, usually 121.6 MHz, 1 point up from the emergency frequency 121.5, for direct communication between aircraft and fire crew once they are in attendance. In the air, reliance is placed on either automatic or crew-operated systems, as most areas, other than the flight deck and cabin, or freight bay for cargo aircraft, will be inaccessible. The drills for most aircraft will be similar in concept, but obviously with individual type differences. For most turbine engines, both jet and turboprop, engine fire warnings will be provided by a fire wire, routed around the engine nacelle, to sense abnormal temperature increases in critical areas, such as could be caused by a hot gas leak from the engine. On receipt of a fire warning, the actions would typically be to reduce the minimum power, select the fuel high pressure cock to off, or for a turboprop, the condition lever to feather, and pull the appropriate fire control handle. These actions will isolate the engine from its fuel supply and close off the hydraulic, pneumatic and electrical systems associated with that engine. At the same time, the fire extinguisher squibs will be armed, and if the warning persists, the pilot would select a fire extinguisher to be discharged into the engine. If, after 30 seconds, the warning is still there, the second extinguisher will be selected. If the warning persists after both extinguishers have been used, land as soon as possible. A sensible course of action in any case. The fire drill for most piston engines would involve closing the throttle, feathering the propeller, thus stopping the engine, and isolating the fuel supply by moving the mixture to idle cutoff. Subsequent actions would include turning off the fuel selector and ignition on the affected engine to isolate possible sources of combustion. Although it is still an unusual occurrence, fires in the cabin area and on the flight deck happen more often than engine fires. Most are likely to be caused by overheating or short circuits in electrical or electronic equipment, particularly in the galley, or illegal smoking. Prompt action to identify and isolate the cause of the overheat will usually prevent it developing into a full-blown fire requiring the use of extinguishers. Currently, there are 2 handheld portable fire extinguishers approved for use within the aeroplane cabin. One extinguisher contains an agent called Halon 1211, and the other contains water glycol. The Halon extinguisher is coloured green, and the water glycol is coloured red. And it is very important that flight deck and cabin crews know which to use, and are familiar with the hazards of using certain extinguishers in confined spaces. There are regulations governing the number and location of handheld extinguishers. There should be sufficient to ensure adequate availability, depending on the number and capacity of passenger compartments, the locations of galleys, toilets and other compartments accessible to the crew, and the need to minimise the hazards of concentrations of toxic gas. The table on the screen shows the correlation between passenger numbers and extinguishers. Where the maximum approved passenger seating is at least 31 and not more than 60, at least one portable extinguisher must be Halon 1211. And where the maximum approved passenger seating is 61 or more, at least 2 must be Halon 1211. The flight deck extinguisher must be Halon 1211. For your information, the lesson includes the latest classification of fires, matched with appropriate extinguisher types. Class A consists of fires involving wood, paper, cloth, and rubber. Class B is for fires of flammable or combustible liquids, such as petrol, kerosene, paint, thinners, etc., but not alcohol or cooking oil. Class C is for fires of flammable gases, such as propane or butane. Class D involves flammable metals, such as magnesium and lithium. The extinguisher that is suitable for electrical equipment, computers, copiers, etc., is not allocated a class letter, but is recognized by the electrical flash symbol. Class F is for fires involving cooking oils and fats, olive and maize oils, butter, lard, etc. Note that the extinguisher categories do not include halon or BCF, which is banned for general use, but which is exempted for aviation and military use, and a few other special applications. Fire detection systems can be fitted in various locations in aircraft, where monitoring by the crew is either not possible or not practical. They work by detecting either heat or smoke. Heat detectors use increases in heat to produce a physical change in a material, altering the conductivity of an electrical circuit, and thus triggering a warning on the flight deck, either visual, audible, or both. Circuits can either be resistive or capacitive. This is the principle used in the engine bay firewire mentioned earlier, and would be used in remote areas such as auxiliary power units and wheel wells. There are two types of firewire detection systems, operating on the principle of their core material having either a negative coefficient of resistance or a positive coefficient of capacitance. The firewire system, which uses the core material having a negative coefficient of resistance, will use direct current, and if it relies on the core having a positive coefficient of capacitance, it will use an alternating current system. Smoke detection systems involve one of two methods. The first uses an electro-optical sensor, which detects a reduction in voltage across a photoelectric cell caused by the interruption of a beam of light by smoke. The second method is the ionized gas system used in domestic smoke detectors, in which the presence of the ionized gas produced by combustion is sensed by the detector cell. These smoke detector systems would be used in internal areas like the freight and baggage compartments, equipment bays, and the cabin toilets. All smoke detectors can be tested prior to flight. The cabin toilets are fitted with an automatic fire extinguisher, which will activate automatically on reaching a predetermined temperature, and the discharge is directed towards the tissue receptacle. It is worth noting that the smoke detector in the toilet is not associated with the fire extinguisher. The saying goes that there is no smoke without fire, and taking the proverb literally, while this may not always strictly be true, it is a reasonable assumption. However, the effects of smoke can be a lot more far-reaching in several ways than the cause of the smoke itself. Smoke can fill an enclosed space remarkably quickly, and, in extreme cases, reduce visibility to nil. Obviously, this would not be good in the cockpit, as the pilots need to be able to see what they are doing, and the extra workload of coping with the problem could cause serious problems at a critical stage of flight. Thorough training and regular and frequent practice of the appropriate emergency drills in the simulator, backed up by a sound knowledge of the aircraft systems, are the best way to combat these types of problems. Crews are provided with oxygen masks and goggles, which will be used in conjunction with the oxygen system, which in these circumstances would need to be set to emergency to provide a positive pressure in the mask to prevent the ingress of smoke or fumes. Protective breathing equipment is covered in more detail later in the lesson. The physiological effects of smoke are initially to cause irritation in the eyes, throat and lungs, and overstimulation of nasal passages, causing coughing and streaming of the eyes and nose. Dense smoke will reduce the lungs' ability to absorb oxygen, resulting in hypoxia, and ultimately asphyxiation and death. It is sobering to recall that, in the Manchester 737 accident of 1985, where a serious wing fire due to a fuel tank breach after an uncontained engine failure on the takeoff roll spread to the fuselage, most of the 55 fatalities were due to inhalation of smoke. In this case, the situation was exacerbated by delays in evacuation, and the fact that as the fire took hold in the rear of the cabin, the burning seat cushions were giving off dense toxic smoke containing cyanide. This accident gave rise to a change in the regulations concerning cabin furnishing materials and flameproofing. Smoke in the cabin, be it from a technical problem or from illegal smoking, can understandably cause grave concern and even panic amongst passengers. As on the flight deck, good training for the situation and calm teamwork by the cabin crew will play a decisive role in coping with the problem. In these circumstances, it is necessary to keep the captain informed, so that he, in turn, can let the passengers know what is happening. Brake overheating is a problem which is only likely to occur either after a rejected takeoff or a high mass landing in marginal field-limited conditions. The actual heating effect is a factor of the aircraft's mass and the rate of deacceleration required. Performance graphs will normally include one for VMBE, or brake energy limit, the maximum speed from which a stop can be safely accomplished within the energy capabilities of the brakes. The energy expended in stopping the aircraft can generate a huge amount of heat. You may have seen this effect if you watch motor racing, with brake discs glowing red under hard braking for a corner. An aeroplane, however, unlike the racing car, will not have any significant cooling airflow during taxiing, and the brakes will remain hot for some considerable time, with the temperature possibly peaking some while after the landing, with the risk of the increase in tyre pressure thus caused exploding the tyre. Again, there will be a performance chart for calculating brake cooling time. No takeoff should be attempted before the expiry of this time, even if the brakes seem undamaged. In extreme cases, the brakes may fade in use, smoulder, or even catch fire, also igniting tyres, or cause tyres to burst, seizing the brakes, and again possibly causing tyre bursts. With these factors in mind, if the aircraft is taxiable after hard braking, a fire vehicle should be in attendance. On VHF frequency 121.6 if available, and the aircraft taxied slowly, using other means of retardation if possible, namely reverse thrust or pitch. Consideration should also be given as where to park, that is, not close to buildings, other aircraft, refueling points, etc. Passenger exits furthest away from the undercarriage should be used, and ground personnel kept well away from the landing gear, particularly abeam the wheels, which could, as described earlier, explode with the temperatures and pressures generated by the heavy braking. With regard to fire and smoke protection, certain safety equipment is required. For aeroplanes, pressurized or unpressurized, and having a maximum takeoff mass of over 5,700 kilos, or a passenger capacity of more than 19, each flight crew member must be provided with protective breathing equipment, PBE, which protects the eyes, nose and mouth, and provides oxygen for at least 15 minutes. Enough PB sets must also be carried for each cabin crew member, and will be stowed at the crew stations, with an extra set adjacent to the fire extinguisher stowage. Where there is a cargo area, a PBE must be located outside the cargo bay, but adjacent to the entrance. Normal communications must be possible whilst using PBE. Aeroplanes having a maximum takeoff mass of over 5,700 kilos, or a passenger capacity of more than 9, must be equipped with a crash axe or crowbar stowed on the flight deck. If the passenger capacity is over 200, an additional crash axe or crowbar must be carried, stowed in the rearmost galley. Such axes or crowbars must not be stowed visible to passengers. Smoke, fire, or fumes on board an aircraft are perhaps the most frightening emergencies that can be faced by crew and passengers. Some problems, such as overheated brakes, can be avoided by sound planning and good airmanship. Other emergencies can happen without warning, but with thorough training and familiarity with the equipment and frequent practice of the emergency drills, a crew will be able to cope with the problem promptly and efficiently, and keep their passengers informed and calm.
In this short lesson, we will see how the loss of pressure in your aircraft can be potentially life-threatening. Decompression is defined as slow, rapid, or explosive, and, under any circumstances, requires that the aircraft is descended to a minimum of 10,000 feet, or the lowest safe flight level, whichever is the highest. Slow decompression is due to the inability of the pressurization system to maintain the required cabin pressure, even though there has not been a failure of the airframe. Slow decompression occurs when the pressurization system cannot overcome the loss of cabin pressure. This could be caused by a leaking pressure seal, a pressure relief valve that does not close fully, or some other inadequacy in the pressurization system. During a slow decompression, passengers and crew should become aware of barometric pressure changes on the ears. Volumetric changes in other body cavities such as the teeth, sinuses, and gut may give rise to some discomfort. A major problem may occur if the decompression goes unnoticed or is incorrectly diagnosed. Accidents which illustrate these occurrences are the Learjet bound for Dallas, Texas, in which the golfer Payne Stewart died, and Helios Airways Flight 522. In this section, we will examine how rapid and explosive decompression can occur and their subsequent effects. Rapid decompression is the result of a failure of the airframe to contain the cabin pressure from the relatively minor rupture of the pressure hull or the loss of a small hatch. The pressurized cabin and outside air pressure are not equalized immediately. An explosive decompression may result in extensive and serious injuries, including loss of life. Here, the airframe is unable to contain cabin pressure, which decreases almost immediately to ambient. This will only occur due to the catastrophic failure of the pressure hull or loss of a major door or hatch. Major damage will occur in the case of an explosive device detonating within the pressure hull, or because of fatigue failure, as was the case with Aloha Airlines Flight 243. Interestingly, a passenger had noticed the crack in the fuselage which caused the failure, however he failed to report it to the crew. In extreme cases of rapid and explosive decompression, sinuses and teeth may explode, eardrums rupture, and severe abdominal distension may occur, resulting in the rupturing of internal organs. The effects, especially in the head, may be pronounced where the person is suffering vent blockage owing to a buildup of mucus due to a cold. During prolonged periods of reduced oxygen, tunnel vision and sensorial depletion will result. For more information on the effects of oxygen depletion, or hypoxia, see Human Performance and Limitations Volume 1, Human Physiology. It has already been mentioned that descent will be necessary, but at what rate? Although all decompressions would seem to require an emergency descent, after a rapid and especially an explosive one, the threat of this maneuver exacerbating structural damage should be a major consideration. This lesson will teach you about the nature and causes of wind shear, including its extreme form known as microburst, its effects on aircraft, and the operational procedures that you will need to know to avoid or counteract those effects. Wind shear is a meteorological phenomenon that can occur normally anywhere in the atmosphere up to the tropopause. It can be defined as an abrupt or localized change of wind velocity, that is, strength, direction, or both. It can occur both vertically and horizontally. As a pilot, you will need to be familiar both with the situations in which you could encounter wind shear and the actions you would need to take to recover safely. The greatest potential risk posed by wind shear to aircraft of any size or type happens at low level and low speed, where an aircraft is vulnerable during initial climb and approach to land. In particular, on the approach, the aircraft is at low level, low speed and low power, and because of that it has a relatively low total energy to overcome potential problems. There can be several causes of low-level wind shear. The first we shall look at is the passage of a front, in which the isobars change direction and thus often become more widely or more closely spaced, giving not only a change in direction, but also a change in speed. Generally speaking, these changes are fairly gradual, but a deep depression with strong winds can produce significant wind shear. A marked temperature inversion can also give rise to wind shear. Below the inversion, the wind will be affected by surface friction, and will thus back and decrease. It may also become turbulent if there are significant obstacles. Above the inversion, the wind is unaffected by these changes to the surface boundary layer. To an aircraft flying at low level, topography and large buildings can have significant effects on the wind. Hills and buildings will cause mechanical turbulence, which causes gusts, but these are usually of short duration. Surface friction will also cause changes of wind speed close to the ground. By far the most dangerous form of wind shear is that which is generated by cumulonimbus clouds, often known as QNIMS, and their associated weather of heavy rain and hail, which can give rise to the phenomena known as microburst, and its bigger brother, macroburst. A microburst is generally accepted to be about 5 kilometers across and of about 5 minutes duration, although gusts and wind shear can be encountered up to 20 miles from the thunderstorm. The downdrafts generated can be very strong, over 6,000 feet per minute has been recorded, and can often exceed the rate of climb of many aircraft, particularly in low speed and power situations as on the approach, and the changes of wind direction and speed are large and sudden. Microbursts have caused several fatal accidents involving airliners and light aircraft. All pilots should treat QNIMS with great respect. The following sequence of diagrams will help to explain what will happen to an aircraft as it flies through a microburst on the approach to an airfield. First, the aircraft will meet a sudden increase of headwind, which will cause an increase in airspeed and a decrease in rate of descent, a gain of energy which takes the aircraft above the desired approach path. The pilot reduces power to regain the desired approach path, and also possibly to prevent exceeding gear or flat limits. The rate of descent increases, and at the same time the aircraft enters a reducing headwind and increasing downdraft, a loss of energy which leads to reduced airspeed, less lift and an even greater rate of descent. As the aircraft continues, the outflow from the microburst is now coming from behind, and the increasing tailwind reduces the airspeed even more, accompanied by an increase in the descent rate. The pilot's problems are added to by the effect of vertical wind shear and the strong downdrafts, which can cause further variations in speed and rate of descent. You can deduce from this sequence that, no matter what type of aircraft you are flying, a microburst is a very serious hazard, and if the correct recovery action is not carried out promptly, the result could be at best frightening and at worst disastrous. It is best then to avoid the hazard rather than have to recover from it. The likelihood of serious wind shear can be ascertained at the flight planning stage by careful checking of weather forecasts, looking in the significant weather charts and terminal aerodrome forecasts, or TAFs, for key symbols and acronyms, such as MTW, mountain waves, TS, thunderstorms, GR, hail from the French grêle, RA, rain, SH, showers, a plus sign indicating heavy, and CB, cumulonimbus. Note that some of these codes can appear in combination. If at any stage of flight any moderate or severe turbulence, wind shear or microburst is encountered, air traffic control must be informed, with details of location and severity of the phenomena to allow them to issue warnings to other aircraft. Ultimately, awareness of the phenomena, which may or not be visible, must be backed up with prompt and positive action should you find yourself experiencing the conditions caused by a microburst or wind shear. If the speed increases suddenly, resist the temptation to decrease power, as the effect will probably be short-lived and will probably be followed by an opposite effect. It would be better to disregard the glide path and raise the nose to control any excessive speed. If the speed reduces and rate of descent increases, set full power and adjust attitude, maintaining configuration and a safe margin of speed in case of further speed losses. If necessary, pitch to the onset of the stick shaker if fitted. It is safer to discontinue a destabilized approach than to try and re-establish stability in increasingly dangerous conditions. The same procedure can be used in the initial climb after takeoff. This lesson has described several sets of weather conditions and situations that can give rise to wind shear, the most hazardous being the cumulonimbus. Remember, cumulonimbus clouds and thunderstorms have huge amounts of energy, capable of generating many hazards. Severe turbulence, hail, lightning and more, including microbursts with rates of descent in downdrafts which can far exceed your aeroplane's rate of climb. Avoidance is the preferred option, but if needed, a successful recovery will depend on a pilot's anticipation and skill, and on adequate reserves of power, height and speed.
In this lesson, we will examine what is meant by the term wake turbulence and how it can affect your aircraft. The term wake turbulence is used to describe the effect of rotating vortices of air generated behind the wingtips of aeroplanes. They are present behind all heavier than air aircraft when they are generating lift, but are particularly severe when generated by larger types. Wake turbulence is most hazardous to aircraft with a small wingspan, and especially during takeoff, initial climb, final approach and landing. The characteristics of the vortex are determined by the aircraft gross weight, the wingspan, airspeed, aircraft configuration and attitude. The vortex patterns from an aircraft may be regarded as two counter-rotating cylindrical air masses trailing from the aircraft wingtips. In an aeroplane with a symmetrical or near-symmetrical aerofoil, such as an airliner, wake vortex generation begins when the nose wheel lifts off the runway on takeoff and ceases when the nose wheel touches down again. Typically, the two vortices are separated by about 3/4 of the aircraft wingspan, and in still air tend to drift slowly downwards at about 500 feet per minute. On approaching the ground, the vortices may move tangentially at high speeds in excess of 300 feet per second, around 180 knots, from the track of the aircraft in still air, but then decay rapidly to an average sideways speed of 5 knots. In a crosswind situation, the outward path of the upwind vortex will be opposed by the crosswind, whilst the downwind vortex will be assisted in the outwards dispersal. If the crosswind component is 5 knots, the upwind vortex will remain dangerously over the runway. Atmospheric turbulence and high winds close to the ground cause vortices to decay more quickly. Thus, it is in conditions of light winds that we must pay additional attention. The greatest wake turbulence is generated by large heavy aeroplanes, which are flying slowly and in a clean configuration. That is, flaps and wheels up. The wake vortices from a helicopter are generated by the downwash of the main rotor, which is transformed into a pair of trailing vortices similar to those of fixed-wing aeroplanes. Evidence suggests that per kilogram of aeroplane mass, helicopter vortices are more intense than those of fixed-wing aeroplanes. ICAO defines wake turbulence categories of aeroplanes by maximum takeoff mass, as shown on the screen. Separation minima are applied to aircraft under the following circumstances. First, when two aircraft are using the same runway or closely separated runways for takeoff, a missed approach or landing. Second, whenever a following aircraft is at the same height as or less than 1,000 feet below the leading aircraft. Wake turbulence separation can either be based upon time through procedural separation or distance through radar separation. The approach to land is a particularly important phase of flight, so we will now discuss the wake turbulence separation minima that will be applied to arriving aircraft. For non-radar, that is procedural separation, a medium category aircraft following a heavy must maintain a minimum of 2-minute separation. Light category aircraft following a medium or heavy must maintain at least 3-minute separation. Using radar separation, the distances shown on screen apply. Wake turbulence separation on departure is the minimum time from when the leading aircraft becomes airborne to the time when the following aircraft becomes so. However, not all departing aircraft take off from the same runway, and this adds a degree of complexity to the separation. A minimum of 2-minute separation is applied between a light or medium aircraft taking off behind a heavy aircraft, or a light aircraft taking off behind a medium aircraft, both under the following conditions. Aircraft are using the same runway, or parallel runways separated by less than 760 meters, or parallel runways separated by at least 760 meters if the projected flight path of the second aircraft will cross the projected flight path of the first at the same altitude or less than 1,000 feet below it, or crossing runways if the projected flight path of the second aircraft will cross the projected flight path of the first at the same altitude or less than 1,000 feet below it. The wake turbulence separation rule for departure changes when the takeoff run of the following aircraft commences at an intermediate point on the same runway or on a parallel runway less than 760 meters away. In this case, the separation minimum is increased to 3 minutes for a light or medium aircraft taking off behind a heavy aircraft, or a light aircraft when taking off behind a medium aircraft. As with the takeoff from an intermediate point, separation minima on departure changes for runways with displaced thresholds. There are two important parts of separation on runways with displaced thresholds. The first relates to the separation between an aircraft taking off after another has landed, and the second, which is the opposite scenario, is for an aircraft landing after another has just taken off. For the first case, there is a 2-minute minimum separation between a light or medium aircraft taking off after a heavy aircraft has landed, and between a light aircraft taking off after a medium aircraft has landed. For the second case, there is similarly a 2-minute minimum separation between a light or medium aircraft landing after a heavy aircraft has taken off and their projected paths cross, and between a light aircraft landing after a medium aircraft has just taken off. The last variation to the wake turbulence separation minima rules is when a takeoff and/or a landing takes place in the opposite direction to an aircraft executing a missed approach, thereby carpeting the runway with its strong vortices. Remember, it is slow, heavy, clean aircraft that produce the largest vortices. If a medium or light aircraft wishes to take off in the opposite direction to a heavier aeroplane initiating a missed approach, separation must be at least 2 minutes. Similarly, When a lighter aircraft approaches to land, in the opposite direction to a heavier aircraft executing a missed approach to the same runway or a parallel runway less than 760 meters away, 2 minutes separation must be applied. These special cases complete our investigation of wake turbulence and separation minima, both in radar and procedural environments.
In this section, we will examine how knowledge of security procedures will empower a pilot to take the correct action in the event of a security breach. Security in civil aviation has been the subject of much national and international law, including International Civil Aviation Organization conferences. Such law and requirements are designed to prevent unauthorized interference with flights and to protect passengers and crew. The responsibility for ensuring that all appropriate personnel are aware of the rules and regulations rests with the operator. He must run training programs to train personnel to minimize the opportunities for unlawful interference to occur. In addition, he must ensure his aircraft carrier checklist containing the procedure when searching the aeroplane for concealed weapons or other dangerous devices. If unlawful interference occurs in flight, the pilot in command has several responsibilities. Firstly, he must try to set the transponder to the unlawful interference code, Alpha 7500, unless the situation warrants the emergency code, when he will try to set Alpha 7700. If ATC requests confirmation of code Alpha 7500, the pilot in command should either acknowledge it or not reply at all. Secondly, he must try to fly along the assigned track until ATC can be informed of the situation, or until the aeroplane is within radar coverage. Where a deviation from the assigned track is unavoidable and ATC cannot be informed, the commander must broadcast warnings on the emergency frequencies. Next, he should consider the use of transponder and any other systems, such as data linking through ACARS, the Aircraft Communications and Report System, to inform and warn ATC and other traffic of his predicament. If a procedure for an off-track deviation has been detailed in regional supplementary procedures, it should be used. If not, the aeroplane should be flown at altitudes which differ from normal cruising levels by 1,000 feet above flight level 290 or by 500 feet below. Following an act of unlawful interference in flight, the commander must report details of the incident without delay to the designated local authority and also the relevant authority for the state of the operator. Each ICAO contracting state is obliged to take all adequate measures to protect the passengers and crew of any aeroplane subject to unlawful interference that has entered its airspace. This duty of care remains until either the aircraft has left the state's airspace or the situation is concluded, and the passengers and crew can continue their journey. As such, each contracting state must provide any landing clearance that is required. However, thereafter, it should take all reasonable steps to prevent the aeroplane from taking off again, unless to do so would endanger the passengers and crew. This contracting state must also keep the state of registry and the state of the operator informed of developments by the most expeditious means. ICAO must also be informed. The only other states that need to be kept in the information loop are those whose citizens are involved under the circumstances on screen. To finish this lesson, we will examine a number of requirements related to security on board the aircraft. Each state is required to establish regulations to prevent the carriage of weapons which could be used in any attempt at unlawful interference. Weapons may be carried on board aircraft only by law enforcement officers and other authorized persons, sky marshals, etc. In order to prevent unauthorized access to the flight crew department, the access door must be capable of being locked from within the compartment. Additionally, this door and the bulkhead between the flight deck and the cabin should be designed to minimize penetration by small arms fire and grenade shrapnel. When a bomb is suspected to be on board, it is imperative that this fact is communicated. If the bomb is suspected by the flight crew, every effort is to be made to contact ATC and/or the operator. Where the information comes from a source on the ground, The flight crew are to be alerted immediately. Subsequent actions will be determined by the nature of the device. General procedures designed to limit the effect of the device will be detailed in the operations manual and/or associated documents. Such measures may include moving the device to a designated least risk location and covering it with as much padding as possible. From 12th of March 2000, a least risk bomb location was mandated as a design requirement. Additional actions may include control of the pressurization system. An explosive decompression will probably exacerbate any structural damage caused by the bomb itself. In any event, crew training programs will enable the crew to tackle the situation as best they can, and every means should be employed to ensure an expeditious diversion to the nearest suitable aerodrome is carried out.
In this lesson, we will examine emergency and precautionary landings and the procedures to follow to minimize their hazard. During the progress of an emergency situation, if it becomes evident that it is desirable to abandon further flight, it should be achieved with the minimum risk to both crew and passengers. In any such event, type-specific procedures will be laid down in the operations manual. To begin with, we will define the terms. An emergency landing is other than a normal landing, where the intent is to preserve the structural integrity of the airframe while allowing a safe evacuation. It would be the kind of event for which a mayday would probably be declared. For example, an uncontrolled fire necessitates an immediate descent to land either on land or to ditch at sea. The time available is very short, a matter of minutes. The Swissair MD-11 accident off Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the Air France Concorde accident diverting to Le Bourget are appropriate examples of this low time factor. A precautionary landing, on the other hand, does not carry the same level of urgency as an emergency one. It is a landing where there is a suspicion that continued flight is inadvisable. This event would probably generate a pan-pan call rather than a mayday. Such an event may be a fire in the hold that has been extinguished, but the extent of the fire damage is not known. To continue, we will investigate ditching. During design, the ditching characteristics of the aeroplane will be explored fully, and final attitudes, speeds and configurations suggested that will give the best chance for the airframe to survive the experience. Statistically, ditching is mostly successful, with 88% of ditchings resulting in few, if any, injuries to crew or passengers. The obvious example is the US Airways A320, which, following a multiple bird strike, was successfully ditched into the Hudson River of New York City. The success of a ditching depends on the level of preparedness, while the success of survival depends on rapid rescue. This will only result from good communications, not only during the initial emergency, but also after the decision to ditch has been made. Ditching is the deliberate act of landing on water. It is not an uncontrolled impact, so the aeroplane must be flown to a controlled impact. Injuries to passengers and cabin crew will be limited by adopting a braced posture, while securely restrained and wearing a life jacket. It is also imperative that loose articles are stowed, seats correctly positioned, and access to emergency exits cleared. The cabin staff will supervise these actions. The flight crew will follow type-specific ditching checklists, which will probably encourage the pilot to land along the swell direction on the crest of the swell. However, if the surface wind is over 35 knots, wave height may well exceed 10 feet, and it may prove beneficial to land into wind. The severity of the impact increases with sea state. It is recommended to land the aeroplane at the lowest possible speed, with the gear up, and at an attitude such that the tail will impact first. The aeroplane should be lowered onto the water, not dropped through stalling. If the approach attitude and speed are both satisfactory, it is inevitable that there will be one or two minor skips before the main impact and settling. The main impact will probably cause a very high rotational pitch force that may dig the nose into the water, compounding the effect. Clearly, this will be enhanced as sea state increases. The main effect will be rapid deacceleration. Therefore, pre-landing preparation of the cabin should be to counter these effects. The aeroplane will come to rest very quickly, and, unless the airframe has been damaged catastrophically, it should float long enough for the crew and passengers to exit the cabin and board the dinghies. The FAA's Aeronautical Information Manual contains much good advice on ditching and is available online. If the nature of the emergency is such that diversion to an en route aerodrome is necessary, ATC should be informed of the decision to divert, the nature of the emergency, and any assistance that is required. It is normal that emergency communication procedures, Mayday or Pan-Pan, will be employed to initially alert ATC to this emergency situation. During the transit, there may be time for ATC to scramble fixed-wing search and rescue assets to escort the aeroplane in the emergency, or to raise the readiness level of assets on the ground. Instructions from ATC should be complied with regarding heights to fly, routing and communications. It must always be foremost in consideration that the situation could rapidly deteriorate, forcing emergency landing or ditching. It will be the responsibility of ATC to alert the ground emergency services, fire rescue, medical, and to pass necessary information to the commander of the aeroplane in emergency. In any emergency situation, fear amongst passengers is inevitable. However, the cause of this fear is ignorance, and the best way to overcome this is to brief the passengers and cabin crew fully about what has happened. Tell them what is being done about the situation, and what is likely to happen subsequently. If a decision is made to carry out an emergency landing, the time between advising the passengers that this will happen and the event itself should be used in preparing the cabin and the passengers. A continual stream of advice and instructions, information and practice will occupy the minds of the passengers. The authority of the commander and the appreciation of the implied skill level of the crew will be reinforced by PA messages from the flight deck. The visual presence of the flight attendants in the cabin until they have to take up their landing positions will reinforce the opinion that the situation is fully under control. Any procedure employed before an emergency landing must include a comprehensive brief to the passengers concerning the evacuation of the aeroplane after the event. The brief must stress the authority of the cabin crew. In a ditching situation, the correct fitting and use of life preservers must be restated. In the event of an emergency or precautionary landing, rapid evacuation of the aeroplane is essential to prevent loss of life. In any emergency, the possibility of fire cannot be ruled out. During the initial passenger brief, the position of emergency exits and the routes to be taken to them from individual seats must be explained. Successful evacuation of the aeroplane relies on firm control by the cabin crew, imposition of strict discipline, and the correct use of the equipment. Drills and crew training are the responsibility of the operator, and such procedures, including preparation for the evacuation, will be detailed in the operations manual. In order to ensure a successful evacuation after landing, the crew will action the evacuation checklist, which will ensure that the engines and systems are shut down once the aeroplane has been brought to a halt, followed by the order to evacuate. The Saudi TriStar accident at Riyadh provides a salutary lesson in what may happen if the engines and systems are not shut down. The TriStar was still being pressurized by the running engines after it had been brought to a stop. Neither the cabin crew nor the emergency crews could open the doors. All aboard died of fire-related or crash injuries while trying to escape the smoke and flames. Type-specific evacuation procedures must be developed and promulgated in Part B of the Operations Manual. EASA mandates in its CS25 certification specifications for large aeroplanes the statutory requirements for emergency evacuation. The certification requires that each crew and passenger area must have emergency means to allow rapid evacuation with either the landing gear extended or retracted, considering the possibility of the aeroplane being on fire. In addition, the certification requires that for aeroplanes having a seating capacity of more than 44 passengers, it must be shown by demonstration that the maximum capacity, including required crew, can be evacuated from the aeroplane to the ground under simulated conditions within 90 seconds. The test criteria require the demonstration be conducted either in the dark or the dark of night simulated, and only half of the emergency exits are available for evacuation. In this lesson, we have studied the definition and implications of ditching, emergency and precautionary landings. We have looked at the EASA regulations and the commander and crew responsibilities if presented with any of these situations. Awareness and training are paramount if any of these situations are to be resolved successfully. In this short section, we will be studying the ETOPS requirements for an aeroplane fuel jettison system, and the responsibility of the flight crew if jettison is required following an in-flight emergency. An in-flight emergency may require an early or immediate landing, and if the current mass of the aeroplane is above that of the maximum landing mass, fuel must be jettisoned to reduce the mass to an acceptable level for landing. In accordance with ETOPS Certification Specification 25, CS25, aeroplanes must have a fuel jettison system installed if it has shown that the aeroplane is unable to meet certain rate of climb requirements at a specified mass if a go-around becomes necessary. The specified mass is the aeroplane's maximum takeoff mass, less fuel used for a 15-minute flight, consisting of takeoff, go-around, and landing back at the departure aerodrome. If an aeroplane can achieve the climb requirements at the point of go-around, it will not require a jettison system. Where a fuel jettison system is required, the system must be capable of jettisoning enough fuel in 15 minutes, starting at maximum takeoff mass, to reduce the aeroplane mass to the specified landing mass at which the rate of climb requirements are met. This will enable an aeroplane to make an approach for landing, and, if necessary, to carry out a go-around and satisfy the required rate of climb requirements. During aeroplane trials, the rate of climb requirements on initiating a go-around for both a non-jettison and jettison system-equipped aeroplane are the same. The requirement is that in the landing configuration, the steady gradient of climb with engines at go-around power must not be less than 3.2%, with a climb speed of VREF in non-icing conditions. When a jettison system is required, it must be shown by flight testing that the jettison system and its operation are free from fire hazards, and that the fuel discharge is clear of the aeroplane. It must also be shown that any fumes do not enter any part of the aeroplane, and that the controllability of the aeroplane is not adversely affected. The fuel jettison system must be designed so that fuel cannot be jettisoned below a set level to safeguard the possibility of the aeroplane running out of fuel. ETOPS state that the jettison system must be restricted to a level that provides enough fuel for a climb to 10,000 feet, plus an amount for a 45-minute cruise at maximum range speed. To enable this, the fuel tanks contain stack pipes or float switches to stop the jettisoning at the required level. Pilots in flight are permitted to jettison fuel at any time during an emergency. However, if possible, it is recommended that the jettison should take place over the sea at a predetermined altitude, usually above 6,000 feet above ground level. Exceptionally, fuel may also be jettisoned elsewhere. In all cases, ATC should be informed before commencement. Additionally, and again, unless there is an overriding requirement to jettison fuel, the aeroplane should, in consultation with air traffic services, be flown to an allocated area at an allocated height before commencing the jettison. Consideration should also be given to the weather conditions. Jettisoning fuel in an electrical storm is not a wise move. In the cabin, if not already illuminated, the no smoking sign should be switched on, and passengers and crew briefed on what is happening. Once jettisoning has begun, electrical switching should be restricted to essential use only. HF radio transmissions should be suspended, and VHF transmissions restricted to further emergency or flight safety communications. During jettison at straight and level flight, the flow of fuel must be visibly monitored, and manoeuvres should be smooth, with the operation of flaps and slats again restricted to essential use. A placard will indicate if the use of flaps and slats will affect jettisoning. Once the jettison is complete, ATC should be informed. In this lesson, we have looked at the EU OPS requirements for a jettison system and the necessary procedures and safety requirements involved. Some items that are carried by air, either in dedicated cargo aircraft or in the hold or cabin of passenger aircraft, are classified as dangerous goods. This lesson will cover the basic regulations and considerations that apply to the transport of dangerous goods, from air freight to passenger baggage. The regulations which govern transport of dangerous goods are issued by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, as Annex 18, and in document 9284 entitled Technical Instructions for the Safe Transport of Dangerous Goods by Air. It is updated every 2 years and gives directions on categorization of goods, packing, labeling and loading, and definitions of associated terminology. Operators are directed to take all reasonable measures to ensure that the relevant instructions are followed. Before looking in detail at some of the regulations, it is worth defining what is meant by dangerous in this context. Dangerous goods can be defined as articles or substances which are capable of posing a significant risk to health, safety or property when transported by air. These articles and substances have been categorized for ease of reference and identification to freight handlers, crew and dispatchers. There are 9 hazard classes which are shown on screen. Students are not required to remember the priority in which they are classed. Some of the classes are separated into divisions because of the wide scope of the class. For example, Class 2, gases, is subdivided into Division 2.1 flammable gas, Division 2.2 non-flammable, non-toxic gas, and Division 2.3 toxic gas. Some items will also have subsidiary annotations to denote additional risks, and in the case of Class 1, explosives, a compatibility code letter to determine their suitability for storage and transport adjacent to other types of cargo. The United Nations also has a system of identifying dangerous goods by a 4-digit number. The numbers are assigned by the UN Committee of Experts on the Transport of Dangerous Goods to identify a substance or specific groups of substances, and range from UN 0001 to UN 3500. The number itself will not give any indication of the nature of the hazard and would have to be checked against a reference list, but will have an associated hazard identifier from the ICAO list previously shown, with a subdivision number or numbers for closer definition. The same numbers are used in the USA, but are given the prefix NA for North America, and are also known as DOT or DOT numbers, since they are issued by the US Department of Transportation. If a substance does not have a UN number, the DOT will issue an NA number in the range NA 8000 to NA 9999. Some articles, normally classed as dangerous goods in the technical instructions, are allowed on board under certain conditions. These items are excluded from the provisions if they are required for operating reasons. For example, supplies of spare engine oil or hydraulic fluid, items of catering or cabin service supplies such as insecticide sprays, medical items for in-flight use as veterinary aids such as tranquilizers or humane killer for an animal, or a medical aid for a patient. The carriage of these items is provisional on several factors, namely that any gas cylinders must be purpose-made and any drugs are controlled by trained personnel. Any equipment incorporating wet cell batteries must be kept upright and securely stowed for takeoff and landing. Some items can be routinely carried by crew and passengers. These include alcoholic beverages, non-radioactive medicinal or toilet articles, safety matches or lighter, but not refills, and gas-powered hair curlers, also excluding refills. Medical items that can be carried are gas cylinders for mechanical limbs, radioisotopic pacemakers, and mercury thermometers if in a protective case. Note that some temporary restrictions have been put on some of these and other items in the recent past, owing to terrorist activity. Notices showing prohibited and allowable items are usually displayed near ticket sales, on ticket stubs and check-in, and security check areas at airports. Responsibility for checking that dangerous goods offered for transport are not forbidden items and are properly classified, packed, marked and labelled lies with the shipper. The shipper must also produce correctly completed dangerous goods transport documentation in accordance with the Technical Instructions Annex 18. The regulations are also published in the CAA document CAP 675. For shipping dangerous goods internationally, the labelling and documentation must be in English. The operator must ensure that goods are carried, packed and labelled in accordance with the technical instructions. In addition, operators must produce and follow an acceptance checklist for dangerous goods procedures. There are restrictions regarding where dangerous goods can be loaded within the aircraft. The technical instructions specify what can be carried in the cabin and on the flight deck, and for dangerous goods, which are carried in the holds, how the freight is to be loaded, segregated and secured. Some dangerous goods will be marked cargo aircraft only, and where this is the case, operators must ensure that the freight is loaded in accordance with the instructions on dedicated cargo aircraft. As mentioned earlier in the lesson, passengers have to be informed of the types of dangerous goods that can be carried on board. This information will be shown on ticket jackets and on notices around sales areas and check-in and security check areas. The operator also has a responsibility to provide the aircraft commander with appropriate written information for the carriage of dangerous goods. Company operation manuals must also include instructions for the crew to carry out its responsibilities and for their actions in event of emergency. Operating companies are required by the technical instructions to establish dangerous goods training programs and keep them updated in line with changes to the instructions. If an in-flight emergency occurs, whether it is directly related to the dangerous goods or not, the pilot in command should inform ATC of the nature of any dangerous goods the aircraft is carrying, and the information will be passed to the destination airport authorities to enable them to activate an appropriate emergency response. If an accident or incident results from the emergency, the operator must inform the state in which it occurs that the aircraft was carrying dangerous goods. If accidents or incidents on international flights involving dangerous goods occur, states are required by ICAO to follow an established procedure to investigate the occurrence and report the findings within 72 hours of the time of the accident or incident. The format of the report is contained in the technical instructions. The information thus gained is intended to help prevent recurrence of similar happenings by revising and improving standard operating procedures. It is vitally important that the findings of undeclared or misdeclared dangerous goods in cargo, mail or baggage be reported. A dangerous goods accident is defined to be an occurrence which results in fatal or serious personal injury or major property damage. An incident in this context is an occurrence other than an accident which results in personal injury, property damage, fire, breakage, spillage, leakage, radiation, or any other evidence that the integrity of any packaging has not been maintained. In addition, any occurrence which seriously jeopardizes the aircraft or occupants, whether on board the aircraft or not, can be deemed to constitute a dangerous goods incident. The title dangerous goods, as applied to air cargo, can cover a wide range of substances and items which, outside the confines of an aircraft, might not normally be considered dangerous, but which require very specific categorization, packing, handling, and notification procedures. These procedures, laid out in the ICAO document Annex 18, Technical Instructions for the Safe Transport of Dangerous Goods by Air, are obviously aimed at the safety of aircraft, passengers and crew, as well as security. So the rules must be strictly followed and applied for the benefit of all.
This lesson covers the subject of runway contamination and its implications for aircraft takeoff and landing performance. To help you understand what is meant by contamination, we shall start with a few definitions. The term contamination is often used by aircrew in a fairly general sense to refer to any precipitation on a runway surface, but the word actually has a specific meaning in this context. A runway is said to be contaminated when more than 25% of the surface is covered by any of the following: surface water more than 3 mm deep, or slush or loose snow equivalent to 3 mm of water. Snow compressed into a solid mass which holds together or breaks into lumps if picked up, referred to as compacted snow. Or ice, including wet ice. A wet runway is one that is covered with water, or equivalent, to a depth less than that defined as contaminated, or has enough moisture on the surface to give it a reflective appearance, but without significant standing water. There are a few other terms used in connection with precipitation on runways. A damp runway is one that is not dry, but does not have a shiny appearance. A runway can be termed dry when it is not damp, wet or contaminated, the category including any paved areas which are either grooved or have a porous surface designed to give dry braking action when moisture is present. Some operations will inevitably have to take place on wet or contaminated runways, with due adjustments to landing and takeoff distances. The factors are covered fully in the performance syllabus. However, takeoffs should not be attempted with a dry snow depth of more than 60 mm, or more than 80 mm of very dry snow, or in more than 15 mm of water, slush or wet snow. A potentially serious hazard that can be encountered when operating from water-contaminated runways, that is, with more than 3 mm, is aquaplaning, also known as hydroplaning. During a takeoff or landing run, it is possible for a tyre to ride up over a layer of water, which has not been displaced by the tyre, which results in the wheel losing contact with the runway. There are three types of hydroplaning, known as dynamic, viscous and reverted rubber. Dynamic hydroplaning is generally associated with a rotating wheel, spin down, on takeoff from a flooded runway when the critical depth of water is greater than the tyre tread depth. As the tyre speed approaches a critical speed, known as hydroplaning speed, a wedge of water builds up in front of the tyre and lifts it clear of the runway surface, thus affecting braking and directional control. The ground speed in knots at which dynamic hydroplaning occurs can be calculated by using the formula for a rotating tyre, spin down, which is multiply the square root of the main wheel tyre pressure in pounds per square inch by 9. Viscous hydroplaning occurs when a wheel locks up on a smooth surface covered by a thin film of moisture, where typically on landing a wheel may skid or lock up, spin up, thus affecting braking and directional control. The ground speed in knots at which viscous hydroplaning speed occurs for a non-rotating tyre can be calculated by the formula 7.7 times the square root of P, where P is the pressure of main wheels in pounds per square inch. It is worth knowing that incorrect tyre inflation pressures or badly worn tyres will have a serious effect on the hydroplaning speeds. Therefore, it is good airmanship to ensure that aeroplane tyres are in good condition, have adequate tread and inflated to the correct pressure. If the tyre pressures are quoted in bar, the value should be multiplied by 14.7 to obtain the equivalent in psi before doing the calculation. In the event that a tyre is hydroplaning and the available friction is insufficient to rotate the wheel, a lot of heat will be generated converting the ice or water into steam. The converted cushion of steam lifts the tyre off the runway, eliminating tyre-to-surface contact, and the steam heat reverts the rubber to a black gummy deposit on the runway, causing the wheel to skid, thus eliminating braking effectiveness and directional control. To give pilots some idea of braking performance under various conditions, a table of braking action was produced based on operations on snow, ice and rainy runways, relating a measured braking coefficient to an estimated braking action. From that, a simple code was derived, but the values in the code and the verbal descriptions are relative to the runway conditions, which means, for example, that code 5, good, on a wet runway would be safe, controllable conditions but not as positive as on a dry runway. The friction coefficient under any set of conditions would be measured by a mu meter or equivalent towed along the runway, usually by an air traffic control vehicle. The device is towed at a given speed, typically 40 miles per hour. It has three wheels, the rear central one measuring speed and distance, and the front two which are angled slightly inwards or towed in, sensing the friction between the tyre and the runway surface. The coefficient is a measure of the difference between the braking effect on a dry runway and that on a contaminated runway for an aircraft at a given mass and speed. The coefficient will vary with speed, being around 0 at very low speed, rising to about 0.5 at 100 knots, and decreasing slightly with further speed increase. Thus, as an aircraft slows down below 100 knots, its braking performance will improve. For all takeoffs and landings, runway length is an important consideration. For takeoff, it is not just a question of whether there is enough runway to get airborne, but also whether there is enough to stop in the event of a rejected takeoff. For landing, there must be sufficient runway in which to brake safely. In both cases, deposits of water, snow, slush or ice on the runway will increase the distances required, either for the poorer acceleration due to the drag caused by the deposit, or for the loss of friction during deceleration. In all cases of contaminated or wet runways, there will be a percentage factor to be added to the calculated performance distances. EU OPS regulations demand that operators ensure that the distance available for landing is at least 115% of the distance required, but this may be reduced if the relevant flight manual contains specific information on these conditions. This lesson need not detail all the factors applied for the various conditions, as these are all covered in the performance syllabus. However, one further factor worth considering is the effect of heavy rain or spray on turbine engines. Large amounts of water ingested by the intakes can cause power fluctuation or even flame out, so it is recommended that continuous ignition is selected to avoid power loss at these critical stages of flight. Some limitations may apply in the case of contaminated runways, and the procedures associated with takeoff and landing are to be found in the Operations Manual, Part B. For example, to reduce the possibility of a crosswind component aggravating any tendency to swing the aeroplane on landing, it is usual for an aeroplane manufacturer to reduce considerably the normal operating maximum crosswind if landing on a contaminated surface. When operations are required on snow or slush contaminated runways, a SNOTAM is available to the flight crew. The SNOTAM contains information concerning the friction measurements on each third of the runway. A sample SNOTAM for Munich is on screen. The validity of the SNOTAM is 24 hours. The two significant items in the decode list are G and H, where G indicates the mean depth of the slush, 1 mm over the entire length, and H the friction measurement for each third of the runway. The three friction measurements of 0.35, 0.26 and 0.26 represent the braking action for each third of the runway. If snow is on the runway and there is a section which has not been cleared, reference to code items D and T will explain the situation. In the code section, item D will represent the cleared runway length in meters, and item T will describe the uncleared length in meters. The sum of the two measurements should equal the published length of the runway. In this lesson, we have looked at how rain, snow, slush and ice on runways can have significant effects on aircraft takeoff and landing performance. Pilots need to be aware not only of the allowances that need to be made in their calculations before flight, but also of the hazards that they may encounter, such as hydroplaning and water ingestion, which require prompt and correct action. Advances in tyre and runway surfacing technology have helped decrease the risks, but the pilot's skill and airmanship will often be the deciding factors in marginal weather conditions.